Welcome back to World Religions, a video series to accompany a semester-long Survey of World Religions class, specifically to accompany the textbook, A Short Introduction to World Religions, edited by Christopher Partridge. Today we're talking about Judaism, and this is divided into 6 chapters: 30 Historical Overview, 31 Sacred Writings, 32 Beliefs, 33 Worship and Festivals, 34 Branches of Judaism, and 35 Judaism in the Modern World. I've added a lot of information to this one to kind of fill in some of the gaps in the textbook. Chapter 30, Historical Overview. Judaism has its historical and partly legendary origins in the lineage of prophetic patriarchs. A patriarch is a male ruler, essentially. The patriarchs of Judaism are regarded as prophets or as having special relationships with God, which include covenants or eternal contracts, or at least contracts that can't be broken or abrogated, unlike ordinary contracts. Arguably, the line of patriarchs of Judaism goes back to Adam, the first man whose creation is described in the book of Genesis, the first book of the Hebrew Bible, Hebrew being the language of the ancient Jews. Another important patriarch described in the book of Genesis is Noah, who is the sole or one of the sole survivors of the Great Flood. Um, the Great Flood was sent down by God basically to punish men or get rid of sin. You could have different interpretations of it, but Noah was advised of the fact and given instructions that would enable him and his family to survive and thus repopulate the earth. And his covenant with God is called the Noahide covenant and was believed to be binding on all people, not just Jews. Abraham, originally known as Abram, but renamed Abraham to mean father of nations, had a special relationship with God, and you could regard him as sort of the origin of the Jewish people. God takes him aside from other men and promises to make his descendants multiply, hence his name, Father of Nations. And in particular, his son Isaac was going to inherit that covenant, and Isaac's later descendants would establish the kingdom of Israel and would be God's chosen people. So Isaac is regarded as the ancestor of the Jews specifically. It's difficult to summarize the history of the Jews. There's a lot of detail, a lot of information in the Hebrew Bible itself. But another very important patriarch is Jacob, who is also called Israel. So he's at least a symbol and maybe an actual founder of the kingdom or the nation of Israel, named after him. He had 12 sons who are associated with the 12 tribes, or you could say tribal districts or tribal subkingdoms of ancient Israel. And he and his sons were living around where the later nation of Israel would be founded. But one of his sons, Joseph, who was spurned initially by his older brothers, left the rest of the family, went to Egypt, and prospered there. For among other things, he interpreted the dreams of the Egyptian king, the Pharaoh, and was favored by the Pharaoh, and eventually was promoted to being the overseer of the Pharaoh's grain. And he eventually persuaded his other brothers and father to move to Egypt. Their descendants multiplied and prospered for several centuries. Eventually, though, a new dynasty of kings came to power, kings in Egypt, and they persecuted the Jews and enslaved them. So centuries later, the Jews were actually in slavery in Egypt. And this story, its historical status has been questioned by modern scholars. It is possible that some of the ancient Jews or the ancient Israelites were in Egypt. There were people of similar ethnicity migrating into and out of and near Egypt around that period, but we don't know for sure that the history as told in the Hebrew Bible is completely historical, and that's not usually the view taken by modern scholars. After the centuries of slavery in Egypt, one of the Jews named Moses which is actually an Egyptian name because he was raised by Egyptians. He was basically chosen by God to help lead the Jews away from Egypt, out of slavery to freedom, and to help settle the promised land, and eventually their descendants would found the kingdom of Israel. So Moses was cast into the Nile River, set adrift, but he was rescued by the daughter of the Egyptian king, the Pharaoh, and raised by her. And that's why he was given an Egyptian name, Moses, and was basically raised culturally as an Egyptian, but he was made aware of his true ancestry. So eventually he came to identify more as a Jew than as an Egyptian, and he saw his people suffering under the yoke of the Pharaoh, and he was also called by God to help lead them to freedom. So there is a very long story. Again, we're compressing a lot, but just to give you some idea of the history or of the story, Moses basically tried to ask Pharaoh to let the Jews go free to end their slavery. The Pharaoh said no, and there were a series of 10 plagues sent by God to punish the Egyptians so that they would let the Jews leave their slavery and thus journey in freedom to the promised land of Canaan, which was to the northeast of Egypt. And these culminated in the Passover, where the Israelites sacrificed their lambs, sacrificed their domesticated animals, and smeared the blood on their doors. And this would be a sign to the angel of the Lord so that it would pass over their homes and not kill them, because this destroyer angel, or you could say the angel of death, was going to all of the Egyptian families and killing them. So this eventually caused or forced Pharaoh to relent. He let the Israelites go. The term Jew, by the way, specifically refers to one of the tribes of Israel, Judah, people of that tribe. But because in later history, that was essentially the only tribal kingdom of Israel to survive, that's why the word Jew became a generic term for what used to be known as the Israelites. So we'll get to that history a bit later. But the Jews, they had to flee in haste from Egypt. So they didn't even have time to let their bread rise. So that's why in this modern Passover festival that commemorates this event of their liberation, they eat unleavened or non-risen bread, matzah. But the journey of the Jews from the slavery in Egypt through the wilderness to the promised land of Canaan is known as the Exodus. And even though Pharaoh initially relented, he eventually changed his mind, gathered his army, tried to go after the Jews. But this was the famous incident of the crossing of the Red Sea or the Reed Sea, depending on the interpretation. It might have actually been a wetland in eastern or east of Egypt that God lowered for the Israelites to cross easily, but then had the water rise up again, preventing the Egyptians from chasing them. Nevertheless, there was still a long years of wandering, 40 years in the wilderness, before the Jews were allowed to settle in the land that had been promised to them in Canaan. And this exodus and these years of wandering are generally interpreted as a time of spiritual testing, where God was trying to test the Jews, but also to lead them to a different way of life and to prepare them for their freedom. And this is one of the most important events in the founding of the religion of Judaism, as well as the Jewish people and the later kingdom of Israel, which was the giving of the Torah, or the books of the law, to Moses on Mount Sinai. So this happened in the midst of this period of wandering. So Moses, he's not the first of the Jewish patriarchs or prophets, but in many ways he's the most important, because the law revealed to him is still followed by Jews today, and it's a huge source of their identity. The covenant made with Moses, the Mosaic covenant, essentially establishes the Israelites, including the Jews, as a chosen people who were bound to follow God's commandments, to enter the promised land, and from there they were to serve as a priestly nation. So among all the nations, they would focus on worshiping God alone. And this was at a time when most, if not all, other people were polytheistic. They worshiped many gods and goddesses, but the Jews were called upon to only worship the God who had made this covenant with Moses. And indeed, Jews tend to be monotheistic. This has probably been the case for thousands of years. They may have originally just been monolatrous, that is, only worshiping one God, but acknowledging the existence of others. But certainly Jews today are monotheistic, so they think that the God that they worship, the one they made a covenant with, is the only one that exists. So there's a lot of details of the covenant, but one of the salient facts is that one of the 12 tribes, the tribe of Levi, or the Levites, were elevated to the role of priests. So in ancient Judaism, there was a caste or a tribe of priests from the tribe of Levi, and they were the only ones permitted to perform certain sacrifices and certain rituals. And the word in Hebrew for priest is Cohen. So when they were wandering through the wilderness, though, this is before they settled Canaan, before the city of Jerusalem, the later capital of Israel and then Judah, had even been founded. And so they had a temporary shrine called a tabernacle, which God instructed them to set up in the wilderness. And according to modern analyses, this is similar to war tents used by the ancient pharaohs of Egypt, and so it was probably inspired by them. On the one hand, we could say both from their own perspective and perhaps to a certain extent, even from the perspective of history of religion itself, the ancient Israelites were a people apart, at least in terms of their theology and other aspects, but nevertheless, they were ensconced in a cultural context, and they were influenced by Egyptian culture and even probably certain aspects of Egyptian religion, as well as by that of other cultures of the Middle East. You can see that, for example, in the tabernacle. And another really important aspect of the ancient Jewish worship was the Ark of the Covenant. So this was created by the Israelites according to the instructions given by God to Moses, and was meant to contain the tablets of the law. This was the commandments given for the ancient Israelites to follow. And this was actually in the most sacred part of the tabernacle, and later in the most sacred part of the temple in Jerusalem. And there was no image or idol of God that was worshipped or to be built. So the Jews were an aniconic religion as a result of this covenant. It's one of the ways that they were set apart from other nations. So much more could be said here, but hopefully that gives you at least a feeling or a flavor of the nature of the founding of the Jewish people. So eventually they came out of the wilderness, and Moses did not live to see the promised land or to journey there. He was able to see it, but he didn't actually lead the people. He passed away, and Joshua took over that role as leader. And according to the Hebrew Bible, the Israelites essentially went around the promised land of Canaan and killed off all the preceding population, the Canaanites, and then occupied the land. Historically speaking, this is doubted by modern scholars. It just doesn't seem to match the archaeological record. Although, as kind of indicated before, it is possible that one or more, maybe some of the tribes or one tribe of the ancient Israelites had been in Egypt and migrated to what later became the area of the Kingdom of Israel, because there were migrations of Semitic peoples like the ancient Jews or Israelites or Hebrews, as they're also known, back and forth from Egypt around that time. And that may have helped inspire some of this history. But they probably didn't all come from Egypt, and they probably didn't all completely wipe out the Canaanites, at least archaeologically, and to some extent, perhaps religiously too. There was overlap or a gradual evolution from, you could say, the peoples of Canaan and then the peoples of Israel. Nevertheless, there was at least some point in history where the peoples in Canaan got a new identity, a new self-conception. Certain aspects of the historicity of the earliest form of the Kingdom of Israel are called into question by modern scholars, but it's at least likely that there was a King David. There's been a reference discovered to his name on an ancient stela, for example, to his dynasty, the House of David. So it's possible that some of this is historical, even if it's not completely or purely historical. So the Israelites move into Canaan, the promised land. According to the scriptures, they wipe out a lot of the Canaanites systematically. But they have a lot of conflicts, a lot of wars with people around them. They're led initially not by kings, but by judges. These are people chosen by God to serve as prophets who give guidance to the Israelites and also lead them in war sometimes against the Canaanites. The Canaanites are worshiping a lot of other gods and goddesses, and the Israelites, at least from their Mosaic covenant, are not supposed to do that. They're only supposed to worship God, but they often slip up and backslide and start worshiping other gods or following the ways of other people. So there's kind of like a constant back and forth, a sort of spiritual tug of war during this period as well, and also in the previous period, wandering in the wilderness. Eventually, there's a leader, Samuel, who emerges, who's a prophet. You might say he's the last of the judges. He also plays an important role in establishing the house of David. I think it's during the reign of Saul. He secretly anoints King David. And this leads to eventually the united monarchy, where the first kings, David and then Solomon, are able to unite the tribes of Israel into one kingdom, and including all of those 12 tribes. Historically speaking, these may have been 12 or X number of different peoples of ancient Canaan who eventually got a common identity through a political union. And partly this story was created, or at least shaped, to help give them a sense of their identity. So Saul is actually the first king of united Israel, but he's succeeded by David, who defeats Goliath, who is a warrior of one of the Philistines, one of the enemies of the Greeks. The Philistines are ethnically very different from other peoples in the region. Historically speaking, their ancestors probably came from Greece or somewhere near the Greek islands of the Eastern Mediterranean around the time of the late Bronze Age collapse. So that would have been a little bit before 1100 BC. And so then by the time the nation of Israel is being founded, the Philistines have been there for a while, but they're still culturally distinct from the Israelites and from other people. For example, the Israelites, part of their covenant is they don't eat pigs. They're considered unclean animals, whereas the Philistines did eat pigs. And there were other cultural differences too. So David, he becomes a leader in part through his victories in war. He's also very known for his Psalms. The book of Psalms in the Hebrew Bible are attributed traditionally to King David. So it's a part of the Tanakh, although not part of the Torah or the revelation to Moses. And there's also King Solomon, who's famous for his wisdom. He built the first temple in Jerusalem. And this temple became the center of the whole ancient Jewish religion. Now, I've been saying the word God when referring to the God of the Israelites, the God of the covenant with Moses, the God of the covenant with Abraham, etc., etc. He actually had different names, but the main one used is this YHWH, called the Tetragrammaton, or the four letters. Traditionally, it was not pronounced by Jews. It was considered sacrilege or a great offense to God to pronounce his name. It'd only be pronounced once a year by the high priest in the inner sanctum or Holy of Holies in the temple in Jerusalem. But he's also called by the name El in the Hebrew Bible, which just means God in Hebrew and other related languages of that part of the Middle East. Modern scholars have reconstructed the pronunciation of this name as Yahweh, and we do see the first part of that Yah appear in some ancient Hebrew names, for example, like Jeremiah or Josiah. The end of those names have that word Yah, which was part of the name of God. So the history and the theology of this are a bit tricky. But what may have happened is there were at least some of the ancient Israelites who worshipped this god Yah or Yahweh, and they came to regard him as the only God worthy of worship, or just then the only God. And that idea kind of spread out to the other Israelites. And there were definitely many periods, though, where the Israelites were worshiping other gods and goddesses. This is actually talked about in the books of the Bible, and one of the main themes is how the kings of Israel and then of Judah are constantly having to attack the worship of these other gods and call their people back only to worshiping the one God, El or Yah. So yeah, but this period of Israel, of the United Monarchy, is regarded as a kind of golden age, the height of the kingdom of Israel, the height of the realization of the promised land for the Israelites. But and after that, there would be periods of union, of division, of persecution, of conquest, and so on and so forth. So a bit more about the ancient religion of the Canaanites before we move on. And keep in mind, it was probably the case that the Canaanites were the Israelites, or the Israelites, at least in part, emerged out of the Canaanite cultures. And that's why you get these descriptions in the Hebrew Bible of the ancient Israelites worshiping some of these gods and goddesses, even though that's criticized greatly by many of their kings and prophets. So El, which is also used as a name for the God of Israelites, this is from a word that just means God, but he was generally regarded as the king of the gods and as a creator god in the ancient Canaanite religion. Other names for him are El Elyon, Most High God, and El Shaddai, God of the Mountain, both of which are also used as names for God in the Hebrew Bible. But originally, he may have been the king of a polytheistic pantheon. For example, Asherah, the fertility goddess, was regarded as his wife or consort. She was also associated with sacred trees called Asherah poles, where people would worship her. Another god that was worshipped in Canaan was Baal or Baal. The name apparently means Lord, so it was sometimes used as just a title of other gods. But when used without additional identification, it was often associated with the god or the lord Hadad, who was a god of storms and fertility. And there was also Moloch, who was a Phoenician god. The Phoenicians were slightly to the north of Canaan slash Israel. The name probably originally meant king or ruler and is related to the word Moloch in Hebrew. But he was infamous because his followers would sacrifice some of their children, usually their firstborn, to him to try to ensure that they would have prosperity and fertility and so on. And there is actual archaeological evidence, by the way, of Phoenician child sacrifice, including among later Phoenician settlers in Carthage and other places in North Africa, because there were Phoenicians. They were a very mobile people. They traded a lot and sailed the seas, and so they actually founded colonies all across the Mediterranean, as far as Spain, actually. But this is a nice example, too, of how these cultures were interacting with each other. There were a lot of cultures right near each other in the Middle East. Egypt, Canaan, Phoenicia, the various kingdoms and peoples of Mesopotamia to the east, which is the modern nation of Iraq, and more too. And so it would not have been that uncommon for a Phoenician god like Moloch to be worshipped by some people in Canaan. And many of these gods are worshipped in what are called high places in the Hebrew Bible. These were altars that were constructed in various places in ancient Israel. And one of the things that some of the kings of Israel would do if they wanted to try to get the people to only worship the God of the covenant is they would destroy these high places. They would also try to destroy or tear down the Asherah poles. So the height of ancient Israel was the United Monarchy, but it didn't last for very long. There were only a few kings where all of the tribes were together in one kingdom. Eventually, they split into the northern kingdom called Israel and the southern kingdom called Judah, because that was the main tribe that made up the southern kingdom. The capital of Israel was Samaria, and the capital of the southern kingdom of Judah was Jerusalem. So Israel, its independence was eventually destroyed. This is the northern kingdom. Around 720 BC, the Assyrians, who were another Middle Eastern people, conquered Israel and forced a lot of the Israelites in the northern kingdom to move. This was a strategy often pursued by ancient emperors. If they conquered another people and they didn't want the people to be rebellious, they would force a lot of them to migrate. And so they would kind of lose their identity, lose their connection to the land. And that's presumably what happened to a lot of the dispossessed Israelites, who are often called the lost tribes of Israel. However, it's not true that all of the Israelites were forced to leave after the Assyrian conquest. And one of the reasons why we know this is because there were a people known as the Samaritans who practiced and continue to practice, there are still some of them alive today, practice a form of Judaism that's similar but different from that of the Jews in the kingdom of Judah to the south. So the Samaritans, they have the Torah, and they believe in the Exodus and Moses and all that, but they don't have any of the later writings of the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh. And what probably happened is this was an early split among the Jews, or you might say among the Israelites, between the north and the south. The north, they had their own traditions, like for example, they didn't worship in Jerusalem, they worshipped on another mountain. And this is still true of the few remaining Samaritans in Israel today, the modern nation of Israel, although there's so few of them, they'll probably die out, unfortunately, in a few generations. But yeah, they retained a separate identity. They're referred to in, for example, the Christian New Testament, the famous parable of the Good Samaritan. Samaritans were looked upon as kind of strange or other or problematic by ancient Jews because they were kind of similar. They knew about Moses and so on, but they had different customs, different traditions. So they were kind of looked upon as strange or vaguely threatening or untrustworthy foreigners. So that's the kind of context for Jesus's parable of the Good Samaritan. But yeah, they basically stayed around, but they declined in numbers and weren't politically independent. The kingdom of Judah to the south, though, remained independent. And there were several kings, such as King Josiah of Judah, who tried to reform the religion to make it more focused in the capital of Jerusalem. They decreed that certain sacrifices could only be performed in the temple there. They made the temple the center of sacrifice and worship. They destroyed the Asherah poles and the high places, as previously mentioned. In particular, with King Josiah, under his rule is when a book of the law was discovered in the walls of the temple. Now, this is not impossible that could have happened because there was an ancient custom of if you had a sacred book that you wanted to get rid of for some reason or hide, you would put it in the walls of a temple or holy place so that it wouldn't be desecrated or made impure. But it's also possible that this book of the law was authored by scribes or priests under the direction of King Josiah to help his idea of how to reform the religion. And it probably corresponded to the book of Deuteronomy in the Hebrew Bible, or the second law. So this is really emphasizing the centrality of Jerusalem and the temple there for the religion. And there are many reasons why this might have been desired by Josiah and other kings of Judah. But among other things, because this was the capital of the king, it centralized the religion, centralized the culture there, and increased the power of both the king and the class of priests who controlled the temple sacrifices in Jerusalem. Eventually, though, the period of the independence of Judah, the southern kingdom, also came to an end with the conquest by the Babylonians, technically the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Nebuchadnezzar II was king, and he succeeded in extending the territory of the Babylonians into Judah and other parts nearby in the Levant or the Middle East, that part of the Middle East. So many of the Jews were taken into captivity in Babylon, just as had been done before that with the Samaritans or Israelites to the north. Although unlike the lost tribes of Israel, the Jews that were in captivity in Babylon or in exile there, they did retain their identity, their language, their religion, their culture, etc. And eventually some of them would return to Jerusalem and to Judah. So the Babylonian Jews regarded still the temple in Jerusalem as the only proper place of worship. And so some of them would even travel all the way to Jerusalem to worship when they could. But in any event, this is the beginning of the diaspora or the dispersion of Jews specifically outside of the kingdom or territory of Judah. And that word diaspora is still used today for Jews living all around the world outside of, you could say, modern Judah or the modern nation of Israel. So, what happened to these Jews? How did they worship without their temple? This is probably the beginnings of the houses of assembly, the Bete Knesset, or synagogues, as they were later called in Greek. Because the exiled Jews could not sacrifice in the temple in Jerusalem, they had to have another place to gather to worship. So the synagogues served as such a place for prayer. There would be singing, chanting, and also teaching and study of the Torah. And the Torah is the part of the Hebrew Bible that was revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai, according to Jewish belief. The fact that the religion was in part focused on Torah study meant that the scribes, those who copied and studied the Torah, they had an important role in this new form of the religion. The scribe's job was to understand the Torah and to help interpret its rules in order to adapt it to the current situation of the Jews. So, for example, if you are not in Jerusalem and can't perform a sacrifice to expiate your sin, what do you do in its place? Eventually, the Babylonian exile came to an end, although there were still many Jews who lived in Babylon. Once the Babylonian Empire was destroyed by the Persian Empire, specifically the Achaemenids under Cyrus II, known as the Great, in 539 BC, this actually permitted some Jews to return to Jerusalem. Cyrus the Great permitted the Jews in Babylon to return and even to rebuild their temple there. And this is described in the book of Ezra. Ezra was the leader of the new group of priests in Jerusalem, and the rebuilding efforts and the reestablishment of Jerusalem and the temple were actually also assisted by Nehemiah, a Jewish official who served in the Persian government of the province of Judea. However, Cyrus did not permit a restoration of the Jewish monarchy, as you might imagine, because he still wanted to be the sole ruler of that territory. This was also the beginning of a strict separation between Jews and non-Jews in Judah. So because many of the Jews had been forced to leave during the Babylonian exile, there were non-Jews living in the area. But there was a cultural, religious, and ethnic separation between the two groups of people. Jews were the ones who were circumcised. This is actually one of the main signs of the covenant with Moses, that male Jews cut off the foreskin of the penis as a way of marking themselves off as this chosen people who has this special relationship with God. So the Jews were circumcised. They observed Shabbat, or the day of rest, which is Saturday in modern terms. And this whole liturgical year of festivals, they recognized the Torah and they made sacrifices at the temple in Jerusalem. And during this time, some also advocated that Jews should only marry other Jews, although realistically there was always intermarriage. With modern Jews, by the way, there's often a belief that a person is only a Jew if their mother is Jewish. But in antiquity, it appears that a lot of Jews, including some that are described in the Bible actually, the men would marry non-Jewish women, but their children could still be raised as Jews. And in the picture is just the prophet Ezra reading from the Torah after he is helping to reestablish the temple in Jerusalem. Eventually, however, the Achaemenid dynasty of the Persians, which actually had created the largest empire the world had ever known to that time, it was eventually conquered by Alexander the Great of the kingdom of Macedon, which was just to the north of Greece, to the west. In the Battle of Issus in 333 BC, he defeated the Persians. You can see the territorial extent of his empire, which was even larger than that of the Persians, mainly because it included parts of Greece and Macedon as well. But it broke up quickly after his death into several successor states. And basically, some of his main generals took over, carved out their own personal kingdoms in different parts of Alexander's empire. So, for example, the Ptolemies were a Greek dynasty who ruled Egypt. The Seleucids ruled parts of the Middle East, such as Syria, Mesopotamia, and parts of Persia. And there was also a kingdom in Macedonia. So during this period, Greek culture, Greek language actually spread throughout the Middle East and even beyond into parts of what's now South Asia and Central Asia. And some of the Jews actually Hellenized. They started speaking Greek. Some of them adopted some Greek customs, read Greek literature, philosophy, things like that. But most of these Hellenized Jews, they would still follow the law. They would still visit Jerusalem and celebrate festivals at the temple there. But there were populations of Jews in a lot of the big cities in these Greek or Hellenized kingdoms, like in Alexandria, Egypt. Alexandria was one of the many cities that Alexander had named after himself. But the one in Egypt, the Alexandria, Egypt, was the largest and one of the most important cities in the Middle East at the time. Eventually, a new Persian empire, the Parthians, was established in the 3rd century BC. They conquered Babylon, and the Jews that were still in Babylon, who had been left there since the exile, became a bit more isolated from the Jews in Jerusalem. And so they started to evolve apart somewhat culturally. The Babylonian Jews spoke Aramaic, for example, unlike some of the Jews further west, especially near the Mediterranean cities, would speak Greek. So there's a bit of a cultural divide there between the Babylonian Jews and the Hellenized Jews. However, despite not having political independence at this time, they were ruled first by Alexander's empire, then by the successor states, then by the Parthians. The high priests and other priests in Jerusalem retained control of the temple and the religion, and they still retained a lot of authority as well as economic power over other Jews. Judaism began to change during this period of Greek influence. So we can speak of Hellenistic Judaism. Not all of the Jews became Hellenized. In fact, there was a cultural divide among Mediterranean or at this time Western Jews, among those who had adopted the Greek customs and those who had not. But many of the Jews living even within Judea started to worship at synagogues, which were places for study of the Torah, even if they also went to Jerusalem to go to the temple to make sacrifice at the main festivals. So the synagogues became very important community and religious centers for worship. Travelers could stay there. They would distribute assistance to the poor. They enforced the rules. They were places for public gatherings. They served as schools for children. And visiting preachers might give speeches or sermons there as well. So specifically within the synagogue, there was a place called the Beit Midrash, or the house of study. And this is where the Bible would be studied. And this kind of helped set the stage for the later development of rabbinic Judaism, which after the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem became the most common type of Judaism. And it's focused on studying the Torah and other sacred scriptures and writings of the religion, rather than performing the ceremonies, the sacrifices at the temple in Jerusalem, which previously had been the main focus of the religion. Also, during this period, some Hellenized rabbis or teachers created rules for interpreting the Bible. A famous example of a Hellenized Jew was Philo of Alexandria, Egypt, who lived from around 20 BC to 50 AD. So one of his innovations was explaining the Hebrew Bible using principles from Greek philosophy. He was especially influenced by Plato and the Stoic philosophers. So he presented, for example, events from the history of Israel, like the Exodus, as allegories of eternal truths. So he introduced this new allegorical form of interpretation of the Bible, which influenced a lot of the Jews of his day. Philo of Alexandria was especially influential on the early and later generations of Christians, which we'll talk about next time, but they grew out of ancient Judaism. So he was less of an influence on the later evolution of rabbinic Judaism, except with this idea of principles of interpretation finding meanings in the text that might not be there obviously or literally. Philo also used this concept of the logos, which is a Greek word that just means word, but it can also mean reason or logic or rationality or theory. But for him, you could say the logos was an intermediary between God and the world, a so-called or as-if second God, although Philo didn't literally believe in two gods, but the idea of this other divine principle that kind of mediated somehow between God and the world. The picture shows an ancient mosaic depicting Herod's temple. Herod was a later king of Judah. And it's from this ancient synagogue at Dura Europos in what's now Iraq. This is the oldest synagogue that's been discovered by modern archaeology, although unfortunately it was completely destroyed by ISIL, an Islamicist group, in the last decade. So eventually, there were Jews who wanted to be independent, didn't want to be ruled by Greek or other kings, and they rose up in revolt against them. The historical context to this is that the Greek king of this part of the Middle East, King Antiochus III of Syria, was defeated by the Romans when they were starting to develop their power. The Romans were in the Western Mediterranean, but by this point they were already interacting with, projecting their power into the Eastern Mediterranean. And that defeat happened from 191 to 190 BC. So that kind of destabilized the political situation, even though Rome didn't directly take over Judea at that time. Some Jews settled in Antioch in Syria and in Asia Minor, and probably some in Rome as well. The Romans, rather than taking over the territory, they exacted tribute from Antiochus the king, which led to Antiochus increasing the taxes on the Jews and others who lived in his territories. There were tensions between rich and poor in Jerusalem and Judah, and also between Hellenized and non-Hellenized Jews at this time. And those tensions continued in later centuries as well. So a few decades later, Antiochus IV, the king of the same dynasty who had been defeated by the Romans, he nominated someone for the high priesthood in Jerusalem. And so at this time, the high priests were basically being chosen, or their choice was directed or influenced by the non-Jewish rulers. So they wanted to make sure that the high priests who had this religious authority in Jerusalem wouldn't become a political problem for them by, rebelling against them or something. So after the Jews resisted the one that he named as the high priest he wanted, Antiochus decided to quell this rebellion. He sent troops to sack the city of Jerusalem. He attacked Judaism and established pagan practices in the inner sanctum, or the Holy of Holies in the temple. And this was basically like a statue to, I think it was the Greek god Zeus that he erected there, just as a deliberate provocation and insult to the Jews, because he knew they would consider that a sacrilege. And this event is called the Abomination of Desolation in the Hebrew Bible. So some Jews submitted to the rule of Antiochus IV, but others, called the Hasidim or the pious, adhered to the Torah, and they were greatly persecuted. Eventually, this persecution led to a revolt led by a family known as the Maccabees. Specifically, Judas Maccabeus led the fight against the Syrians, and eventually he forced them to make a deal or treaty with him in 165 BC. He was able to occupy Jerusalem, cleanse the desecrated temple, and reconsecrate it. And this event inspired the later festival of Hanukkah, or the Festival of Lights. based on a miracle that happened when he was reconsecrating the temple. So Judas Maccabeus was the founder actually of a dynasty or kingdom called the Hasmoneans, and they ruled for several generations of kings. They were never fully recognized as an independent or autonomous kingdom, but they had a degree of autonomy under the Syrian kings. However, many of them were Hellenized. They ruled as Hellenistic despots, and their influence on the priesthood was considered illegitimate by many Jews. And in fact, that led some Jews living in Judea to reject the authority of the priests there. And this kind of led to the split between the Sadducees, or the party of the priests, and other parties or sects of Jews, like the Pharisees, who put more emphasis on studying the Torah, for example. Eventually, Rome did spread to this part of the Middle East, and the kingdom or the province of Judea became a vassal. They became subject to the Roman Empire in 63 AD. Specifically, the Hasmoneans were conquered by the Romans under Pompey. And the Hasmonean king was retained, and he was confirmed as the ruler and high priest of Judea, but he was stripped of the title king, Basileus in Greek, because the Romans didn't like the idea of having a potentially independent kingdom in the midst of their empire. Now, later on, there was a Jewish ruler, Herod the Great, who was living from around 73 to 4 BC. And around 40 BC, he was given the title king of the Jews by the Romans, but he was still a client or subject of the Roman Empire. He had a scandalous personal life, but the province of Judea prospered under Herod's rule. He built cities such as Sebaste and Caesarea, fortresses such as Masada and Herodium, palaces, theaters, amphitheaters. So he was definitely a Hellenized Jew. But he also helped rebuild and restore the Second Temple in Jerusalem. Herod was hated by a lot of the Jews, though, who opposed Rome and the Hellenization of Jewish culture. Many Jews hoped for a Messiah or an anointed one who would come to restore the ancient kingdom of Israel. And the word Messiah, which means anointed, is a reference to the fact that the ancient kings of Israel and Judah would be anointed by a priest or a prophet to help show or to give them the authority to rule. They'd be anointed with olive oil. Nevertheless, Messiah didn't come and didn't save the Jews from the Romans. Emperor Caligula was especially problematic for the Jews in Judea, because he demanded that all of his subjects worship him as a god. This was a conceit of some of the Alexandrian era rulers and after, but also some of the Romans, that they were divinized or made into gods. And partly the government did this for political reasons, as kind of like a loyalty test. Like, one way you could show that you were loyal to Rome was by worshiping the emperor as a god. And Caligula ordered a statue of himself as the god Zeus, or as an aspect of Zeus, to be placed in the temple, which was definitely a provocation for the Jews. It was kind of a reenactment of the abomination of desolation under the king Antiochus IV. So all of these provocations and insults led to a revolt of the Jews against the Roman Empire. And this was against a backdrop of constant conflict between Greeks and Jews in the coastal cities. So even though it was the Roman Empire, most or many of the non-Jews or other people were Greeks, or people who spoke Greek, because Greek had been the culture spread to this part of the world after the time of Alexander, especially. So the Jewish revolt started in 66 AD, and the Jews were initially successful. But Rome was a very large empire. They could field very large forces, and eventually the Romans prevailed. They sacked the city of Jerusalem, and they utterly destroyed the temple in 70 AD. So what were the consequences of this? The Jews ever after lost the temple as the center of their religion, which was huge. The priesthood was essentially disbanded or abolished, and the Sanhedrin, or the priestly council, which previously had governed the Jews, at least in religious matters, was gone and never to be reconstituted, at least not under the same form as a priesthood based in Jerusalem. So, yeah, this was the beginning of the rabbinic Judaism, which was no longer centered on Jerusalem and the temple worship, or the priesthood even. The Romans actually ended up completely destroying, tearing down, practically brick by brick, stone by stone, the old city of Jerusalem after the Jewish revolt. And they built a new city, which they called Aelia Capitolina, near the ruins of the old one. This city of the Romans, Aelia Capitolina, is kind of like the ancestor of part of the old city of the modern city of Jerusalem. In the picture, you can see some Roman soldiers holding the menorah and other treasures that they had looted from the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. And this is part of a triumphal work of art on Trajan's column in the city of Rome. So it's kind of like historical documentation of what the Jews did in the temple, and destroying it utterly, seizing all of its possessions, desecrating the Holy of Holies, etc. So, Rabbinic Judaism emerges after the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans. And the Jews that ended up having influence were the ones among the Pharisees, or kind of descended from them. The Pharisees were an ancient sect of Second Temple Judaism, emphasizing study of the Torah more so than performing the sacrifices in the temple. And in that regard, they were often opposed to the Sadducees. The Pharisees also had a slightly different scripture than the Sadducees, because they included other texts like those of the prophets, like Isaiah and, for example, not just the Torah or the 5 books of Moses, which was the one used by the Sadducees. And the Pharisees' version of the scriptures ended up influencing that used by Rabbinic Judaism, and thus Jews today. Yohanan ben Zakkai founded a school at Jamnia in Galilee, which was part of Judea just to the north of Jerusalem. And this is around the time that rabbi, teacher, or master became the title for all teachers of the Torah. So Yohanan ben Zakkai had a huge influence on the development of Rabbinic Judaism. And Rabbinic Judaism is just a way of referring to how Judaism in general changed after the destruction of the Second Temple. He had a lot of authority. For example, he was able to fix the calendar for Jews living abroad outside of Judea, once this had been the prerogative of the high priest of the temple. In other words, the rabbis became the new authority after the destruction of the temple and the priestly hierarchy there. The successor to Yohanan ben Zakkai was Gamaliel the elder, who was originally a Pharisee. And so you can see just the kind of transition there from the Pharisee party or sect to Rabbinic Judaism. The school at Jamnia was a really important center for Rabbinic Judaism. It served as the new Sanhedrin, the new council of the Jews. And Jews looked to this council for advice and judgments, as opposed to the old priestly class. Tanaim, or teachers, was another name for the rabbis of this particular period. An important text was the Pirkei Avot, which included sayings of the Tanaim. So the name means ethics of the fathers. Mishnah is 2nd century AD Hebrew written versions of the Jewish oral tradition. And this was also composed by this group of Tanaim, or teachers. So Rabbinic Judaism includes other texts and traditions like the Mishnah that were not a part of ancient Judaism. And ancient Judaism can refer to like the Judaism of the First and Second Temple periods being the main examples. So eventually there was another Jewish revolt against the Romans. This was led by Simon bar Kosaba, also known as Simon or Shimon bar Kokhba, son of a star. He claimed to be the Messiah, the anointed one who would restore the kingdom of Israel. And he was supported by the greatest rabbinic scholar of the day, Rabbi Akiva ben Joseph. So this revolt may have been instigated by the Romans building Aelia Capitolina, but the revolt took place in 132 AD. The Romans eventually defeated the uprising, and they kind of obliterated, for the most part, the Jewish presence in Judea as a whole. They renamed the province Palestine, which was a direct, deliberate insult to the Jews because they knew enough about Judaism to know that the Philistines were the ancient enemy. They were no longer really around as at this time as a distinct ethnic group, but in Jewish tradition, the Philistines had been one of the main enemies of the ancient kingdom of Israel. And so, just as an insult to the Jews, they renamed the territory Palestine, which was the Latin version essentially of Philistia, or the land of the Philistines. And Jews were forbidden from entering the new city of Aelia Capitolina. Jews were also forbidden from circumcising converts to their religion because the Romans wanted to prevent people from converting to Judaism. And what ended up happening was that Galilee, to the north of Jerusalem and Judea, became the new center of Jewish life, at least in that part of the Middle East. And there were a bunch of different towns that became the seat of the Jewish council in succession. But this kind of disrupted the Jews' connection to Jerusalem, which arguably wasn't fully restored until modern times with the foundation of the modern state of Israel. So the rabbinic Jews, after these failed revolts and their partial expulsion, dispersion from Judea, they had new authorities to help govern them and give them unity and guidance. So this included the Palestinian Patriarchate. Simeon ben Gamaliel II became the president of the new non-priestly Great Sanhedrin and the first Palestinian Patriarch. So this is a title given to this ancient rabbinic religious authority. And ostensibly, he had, or at least claimed, authority over all the Jews in the Roman Empire. Judah I, the prince, who is the son of Simeon ben Gamaliel II, and also known as Rabbi HaKadosh, he was a noted scholar, and he had considerable influence as well over the Jews of this period. This would have been the 2nd century AD. During his period of authority, the Mishnah was codified and published, or really copied and spread, among Jewish communities. Eventually, though, this new authority, this rabbinical authority, came to an end. The end of the Patriarchate was with the execution of Gamaliel VI by the Romans in 425. And so this was the final dissolution of the Sanhedrin, and really like one of the instigating events in the development of later rabbinic Judaism. So things also changed for the Jews after Christianity started spreading more rapidly in the Roman Empire. Christianity started as a sect of Judaism whose followers claimed that their leader, Jesus of Nazareth, was the Messiah. So they called him Messiah, or Christos in Greek. And initially, his followers were mainly Jews from Galilee and Judea and other nearby regions, but he started to get a lot of Gentile or non-Jewish followers after his death. One of his early followers or disciples, Paul, who originally persecuted the Christians, he was a Jew, a Pharisee who didn't like them and thought they were heretics. He converted and started converting a lot of Gentiles or non-Jews, including Greeks, Romans, and many others. And so Christianity started to spread throughout the Roman Empire, and there was tension and hostility between the Jews and Christians. They basically each accused the other of being heretics and non-believers. And so eventually, as more and more people became Christian, this also caused some pressure against the Jews in that part of the Middle East and Mediterranean, like parts that were Roman essentially. The Jewish community in Egypt had begun to recover, but it never reached its previous height, and kind of like the glory days of the Hellenistic kingdoms. And Greek culture and Hellenistic Judaism also began to decline with the transformation of Roman Empire into a Christian empire. There's kind of like a gradual diminishment of Greek cultural influence, and that was kind of sealed after the areas in question were conquered, first by the Persians and then by the Arab Muslims. So a bit more about that history. The transformation of the Roman Empire, the eventual decline of the Roman Empire. So this was a gradual process. The first part of the Roman Empire to be lost was actually in the west, which was conquered by different German tribal kingdoms and kind of divided up. Um, it's debated exactly when the Western Roman Empire collapsed, and because there were Roman emperors ruling, at least in theory, through much of the 400s, but their power had basically already been largely broken by that time, and their lands taken by these German kings. The last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed in the year 476 by a German king, Theodoric. But the Roman Empire did continue in the east with its capital at Constantinople. This was the city founded by Constantine the Great, the one who had converted to Christianity, and helped give legal tolerance to Christianity, because at first the Romans were trying to suppress it. Um, and the Eastern Romans, they ruled the Jews in Palestine pretty harshly. So this didn't make the Jews loyal to them when the Persians invaded in 614 AD. Although the Jerusalem Jews rebelled in 617, they were later defeated by the Romans. This territory is being kind of like fought over back and forth by the Romans and the Persians. These wars between them, by the way, helped weaken them and make them more vulnerable to eventual Muslim conquest a few decades later. And the Jews, though, after their failed revolt against the Eastern Romans, were again expelled from Jerusalem. Meanwhile, in the Sassanid, or the New Persian Empire at this time, the Jews had, there were still Jews there, like in around Babylon, for example, and they had their own religious authorities. The exilarch was the title of the ruler of the Jews of the diaspora in Babylon specifically, and he was given an official status by the government in Babylon. However, relations between the Babylonian Jews and the Persian authorities became difficult. So the Babylonian Jews actually welcomed the Arab Muslim conquerors when they came in the 7th century. And the Arab Muslims also recognized the authority of the exilarch. And Babylon became a very important center for Judaism for many centuries after. So Islam started in the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century AD as a result of revelations to the Prophet Muhammad by the angel Gabriel, at least according to the Muslim view. And this religion was also a kind of kingdom or empire that spread through conquest. And they were able to rapidly defeat and essentially gobble up a lot of the territories of both the Eastern Romans. That would include like Syria, other parts of the Near East, and North Africa and Egypt. And they also conquered not that long after the Persian Empire in 637. They then invaded further to the west in North Africa and eventually reached Spain by 711 AD. So it was a very rapid-fire series of conquests. Many Jews prospered under Muslim rule. They served, for example, as translators. A lot of them could speak Arabic, but also other languages, and scholars. There was also a lot of Arab language scholarship at this time. The Arab-speaking philosophers translated works from Greek, Persian, even Chinese and Indian languages. So they authored texts on mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, chemistry, medicine, philology. And a lot of them worked kind of alongside or in the same kind of scholarly circles as Jewish scholars. So there was kind of like a revival in part of Greek learning and other things during this time. And the Jews played an important part of that, both in the Middle East and also in Spain. So an example was Saadia Gaon, a Jewish philosopher, and he in particular grappled with the problem of the relation between faith and reason. And he also authored several proofs of the existence of God. So that gives you a kind of flavor of how there were these generations of Jewish scholars who were influenced by Greek philosophy, by Arabic culture, as well as by their own tradition. So Gaon is actually a title. It refers to heads of these academies in Babylon. And their authority, their religious authority over Jews grew after the year 600 AD. They helped ensure that the Babylonian Talmud became widely accepted by Jews in general. The Babylonian Talmud is a collection of many different documents that were compiled by academies in Babylon in the 3rd to 5th centuries AD. The Gaonate of Palestine, in contrast, was established in the 9th century AD, and it was more recognized as authoritative by the Jews then living in Spain, Egypt, and Italy. So they had these kind of two cultural spheres, one more Western, one more Eastern. What were some of the new forms of rabbinic Jewish literature that were being authored during this period? Well, very importantly, the text of the Bible used by rabbinic Jews was fixed and annotated. So certain books, for example, that had been used by a lot of Jews in antiquity as scriptures, including ones that were part of the Septuagint, a Greek translation of the Bible used by Hellenized Jews and early Christians, some of those were not included in the new edition, like, for example, the books of the Maccabees. And very importantly, the rabbis of this period fixed the annotation of the original Hebrew text. So ancient Hebrew only had consonants, not vowels. And also, the sentences were not punctuated. So it required an active interpretation, both to decide which vowels went with the consonants and thus which words were referred to, and exactly, for example, when one sentence ended. And if you look at the interpretations adopted by Rabbinic Judaism during this period, some of them are different from that adopted by the ancient Jews who translated the Bible into Greek for the Septuagint version. That was in several centuries BC. So this is, a long time later, almost 1,000 years, that the rabbinic tradition is established. But other forms of rabbinic literature is collections of Talmudic laws, poetry composed in and meant to be recited, often in the synagogues, prayer books, and so-called responsa, or she'elot ve-teshuvot. This is questions and answers, where people would submit questions to the Gaons, they would debate them in the academies, and then they would be answered. The picture shows one of the rabbis of this period, Rabbi Ashi, at the Sura Academy in Babylon. There is also another form of Judaism apart from Rabbinic Judaism that developed in this period called Karaite Judaism. It was founded by Anan ben David, who lived from 715 to 795 AD. So how are they distinct from Rabbinic Jews? The Karaites rejected the Talmud and all forms of the so-called oral law, such as the Mishnah. The oral law is believed by Rabbinic Jews to have been revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai along the written law, but according to the Karaites, that was not so, and so they only accepted the written law. And they do have other books of the Bible besides the Torah, so they have essentially the same Tanakh, or collection of scriptures, as Rabbinic Judaism, but they don't regard the later commentaries and other texts as authoritative. So Karaite Judaism does survive until today, but only in very small numbers, and they're nowhere near as influential as Rabbinic Judaism. There was also an interesting series of scholars that developed in Spain under Muslim rule, largely. So Spain had been conquered by Muslims around 711 AD, and eventually Spain was reconquered by Christian kingdoms there. But under the periods of Muslim rule, there were several Jews who rose to influential positions at the courts of the Muslim kings. Some of them also worked for the Christian kings. Spanish Jews are called Sephardic Jews after a name for Spain that they used. They spoke a dialect of Spanish called Ladino, but it had, for example, certain Hebrew and Arabic loanwords. So it's kind of considered a separate language. And I think they wrote it with the Hebrew alphabet as well, rather than the Roman alphabet. A very famous scholar from this period is Solomon ibn Gabriel, shown in the picture. And he attempted to reconcile Judaism with Neoplatonist Greek philosophy. Neoplatonism is a later form of or revival of the philosophy of Plato, started by a philosopher from Syria, I believe, named Plotinus. But they kind of added a few new interpretations of Plato or teachings, and also some of them tried to synthesize or harmonize the philosophy of Aristotle, another very famous ancient Greek philosopher, with that of Plato. But for the purposes of Ibn Gabirol, the most influential teaching of theirs was this notion of emanations, that there's a first principle of being or reality that the Neoplatonists called the one or the good, but which corresponded in Jewish thought to God, and that this being is the cause of everything else. But the sort of act or process of creation is conceived of by the Neoplatonists as a series of descents or emanations from the one to lesser forms of being. And this was a very influential view, not only on Ibn Gabirol, but on many ancient and medieval philosophers, both Jewish and Christian and Muslim, as well as the later pagans of late antiquity, although their tradition eventually mostly died out. So his interpretations of the emanations of God influenced greatly Kabbalah, which is the Jewish mystical tradition. Judah Halevi of Toledo was also a very famous Jewish scholar of this period, and one of his works has a fictional dialogue between a Jewish scholar and the king of the Khazars. The Khazars were a Turkish tribe from Central Asia who had a powerful kingdom and who famously decided to convert to Judaism. And in this dialogue, it argues that philosophy could prove God's existence, but that revelation, such as to the Jewish prophets, was necessary to know more about him, to complete what reason can accomplish on its own. And this, too, was a very common view, for example, of Christian philosophers of the Middle Ages. So what about the Jews in Western Europe in the medieval period? In the mid-11th century and after, there were Western Jewish scholars that became more important for the Jews there than the Gaons. And there was a philosophical shift as well in the Middle Ages, particularly starting in the 1100s, from Plato to Aristotle. An example of a very important Western European Jewish scholar was Rashi, or Rabbi Solomon ben Isaac, also known as Shlomo Yitzhaki, who lived from 1040 to 1105 AD. So he was from France, and he produced standardized commentaries on the Bible and Talmud that were used by a lot of Western European Jews. His commentaries are still printed today with the Talmud, together with additions by later scholars. And one of the main things that was debated during this period was whether Aristotle's philosophy, which was considered the foremost philosophy of nature or physics, metaphysics or theory of being, ethics, etc., whether all that could be reconciled with the Bible. And this was true both for Jewish scholars in the period and Christian scholars like Aquinas and others debated this. Many of the scholars of the 11 and 1200s attempted to reconcile Aristotle with their religion, whether it was Judaism or Christianity. The most famous Jewish philosopher in this tradition was Moses Maimonides, or Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, who lived from 1135 to 1204. And he authored a code containing all of the Halakha in his Mishneh Torah. So the Mishneh Torah, or copy of the Torah, was kind of like his extended commentary and summary of the Torah, or Hebrew scripture. He was exiled from Spain to Egypt. So he learned Arabic, and he authored this text, The Guide for the Perplexed. And this was his detailed philosophical text on the difficulties of reconciling Aristotle's philosophy with Judaism specifically. He also emphasized right belief or orthodoxy, not just right practice or orthopraxy. He's also famous for his 13 principles of the faith, which are regarded as 13 roots or fundamental principles of Judaism. But he emphasized the unity and oneness of God and the kind of harmony of the late Neoplatonist view of the one, or first principle of being, with the Jewish view of God. And there was a sense of a lot of both Jewish and Christian philosophers of this period that it was not accidental that the later pagan philosophers of antiquity had kind of stumbled upon or discovered through reason this principle of the one, or the good, or as Aristotle would say, the unmoved mover, which is the cause of the creation. And that there was a kind of harmony between that view and what was revealed to the ancient Jewish prophets. So Jews prospered in Spain and many parts of Europe. Some of them are scholars, some of them engaged in trade and later banking, because usury or loaning at interest, while very essential for the economy, was forbidden to Christians under traditional Christian law. But there eventually were a lot of reactions against Jews, anti-Semitism or discrimination against Jews. And anti-Jewish sentiments became common in France, for example, from the 10th century on. And there was also the Crusades, which were a series of wars where there'd be knights and others from Western Europe traveled to the Holy Land. So this is Judea and surrounding lands, and they try to retake it from the Muslim rulers there. These wars had been triggered by Muslim persecutions of Christian pilgrims going to Jerusalem. However, the Crusaders committed a lot of persecutions and crimes of their own, sometimes fighting other Christians, slaughtering Jews, massacring civilians. Really bad stuff happened, as well as just folly and stupidity, all kinds of things. So, for example, the Crusaders killed and looted some Jews on their way to the Holy Land. And among other people that they killed in Jerusalem were some of the Jews that were still living in that area. Some Jews in this time regarded a death in that way as a martyrdom or sanctification of the name, Kiddush Hashem, as they would call it. And also, some Jews committed suicide rather than renounce their faith during this period. But there were many accusations against the Jews that were totally fabricated, basically like medieval conspiracy theories that Christians used to justify their oppression of the Jews. One of them is the blood libel. Some Christians claim that Jews were guilty of ritually murdering Christian children and then using their blood during their Passover feast. No truth to this, as far as I know. Libel of desecration of the host. Some Christians claim that Jews would steal the consecrated bread of the Christian Eucharist, which is believed to be the body of Jesus, and stabbed it or burned it. Again, apparently wholly fabricated. And it's kind of interesting because you can see in these kind of paranoid, delusional conspiracy theories justifying oppression, kind of like ancient echoes, if you will, of some modern versions of the same thing that are popular today. So this map shows some of the expulsions of Jews from different countries in Europe at the time. In England, Jews arrived in the 11th century, but they were expelled in 1290 and didn't return until after 1650, when, in particular, there were Jews in Amsterdam, many of them of Portuguese descent, who migrated to England, and then Jews from other parts of Europe migrated there as well. And there was a flourishing community of Jews in London, at least for a while. In southern Italy, from 1290 to 1293, there were many Jewish communities destroyed and some forced conversions. There were also ghettos or segregated parts of cities set up for Jews in Italy and other places. The word ghetto is from Italian, and it refers to these Jewish segregated areas. That was the original meaning of the word. In France, Jews were expelled in 1306, and there were massacres in 1348. And also, Jews were falsely accused of poisoning wells and of causing the Black Death or bubonic plague in 1348. So just a lot of persecution, a lot of suffering over the centuries. And you can see on the map, the expulsions were kind of in all directions, Jews moving around to different places. Some ended up moving further into Eastern Europe as a result of this, where they were actually welcomed, at least initially, by a lot of the kings there because they helped found towns. They were economically productive. They were either traders or bankers or craftsmen and all this kind of thing. So that's why some of them ended up moving into Poland and Lithuania and other places to the east, as well as places in the Ottoman Empire. So medieval Spain consisted of Christian kingdoms in the north and Muslim in the south. And the Christian kingdoms in the north gradually expanded southwards and kicked the Muslims out of Spain. This is called the Reconquista. And the main Muslim dynasty, at least initially, around the year 1200 rather, was the Almohads. And this particular dynasty was not kind to the Jews, so they kind of reversed the earlier practice of tolerating and even promoting Jews in that region. And so this forced some Jews to migrate outwards. And the Christian rulers in northern Spain at first welcomed the Jews from the Muslim part of Spain. Many of them became moneylenders since usury was forbidden to Christians. They were very educated. A lot of them were scholars. They could serve as officials or they could perform important economic functions. So they're actually encouraged at first. But then eventually Jews began to be attacked by the Christians in Spain. And this reached an initial peak in 1391. So after this time, some Jews started to convert to Christianity just to avoid persecution, although many of the converts were still kind of reviled by other Spanish Christians, and they were called marranos, or swine. They're also known as conversos or converts, though. In 1492, the King and Queen of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, passed an edict that required all the Jews to convert to Catholic Christianity or leave Spain. So many did flee, many did leave to other parts of Europe, like to Amsterdam, for example, or to places in the Middle East, such as Safed and Galilee. But some converted to Christianity, although some proportion of these converts or conversos actually continued to secretly practice Judaism in their home, and they were known as crypto-Jews. And this was one of the reasons for the Spanish Inquisition, which was a religious court set up in Spain to interrogate Christians to see if they were actually faithful Christians or they were secretly being heretical. Apparently, some of these crypto-Jewish families kept up their customs up to, or at least almost up to modern times, although for many of them, if not most or all of them, at some point they would often forget the source of these family customs and not even realize that their family was Jewish. So even though they kept up some of the Jewish customs, there was a kind of gradual decay of the sense of Jewish identity. Interestingly, some of these crypto-Jewish families also migrated to Mexico when it was under Spanish rule, and some of them are still there to this day. So Kabbalah is Jewish mysticism, and you could define mysticism in different ways. One definition, I think this is the one pretty much adopted by the textbook, is that it consists in belief in direct vision of divine things. And it's a way of experiencing things other than through ordinary sense perception or intellect. And I would add it often involves an alteration of the usual sense of the self, such as a sense of union with God or some other supernatural or sacred being. Kabbalah, or the Jewish mystical tradition, developed in Spain. There was actually a more ancient Jewish tradition known as the Merkabah or chariot tradition that was practiced under Second Temple Judaism, if not before. But it seems to have been disrupted after the destruction of the Second Temple. I think elements of it were preserved and kind of fed into Kabbalah, but Kabbalah was influenced by other things as well, including the Talmud and the Sefer Yetzirah, or the Book of Creation, which emphasized the mystical meaning of the letters in the Hebrew alphabet, which, for example, could also stand for numbers, but they also had different associations with them. Kabbalah was interestingly also influenced by Greek Neoplatonism, specifically the concept of God's emanations into the world. A famous text of Kabbalah is the Zohar, which means splendor or radiance. It contains things such as a mystical commentary on the Torah and mystical cosmologies and psychologies or theories of the human soul. So Jews continued to both prosper but also to be periodically persecuted during the late Middle Ages and Renaissance, so the period from around 1400 to 1600. The Ottoman Empire was a Turkish dynasty established initially in a lot of the lands formerly ruled by the Eastern Romans and the Persians, and then by the Arab Muslim dynasties in the Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East. The Turks, though, by this time had converted to Islam, so the Ottoman Empire was a Muslim dynasty. And actually later on they considered themselves kind of like the inheritors of the original Muslim caliphate, as well as being kind of like the inheritors of the tradition of the Eastern Roman Empire. They conquered Constantinople, the capital of the remnant of the Eastern Roman Empire, in 1453 AD, and they later conquered Palestine in 1515 and Egypt in 1517. And then later they expanded into Europe, getting all the way to Vienna, where they were finally stopped and defeated in 1683, and then gradually forced back over the centuries. There were many Jews living in the Ottoman Empire, mostly Sephardic or originally of Spanish Jewish ancestry. Although there were also some what are called Mizrahim or Middle Eastern Jews living in the Ottoman lands as well. So in Germany and Central Europe during this time, the Jews started speaking a dialect of German called Yiddish. Yiddish was just a kind of German word meaning Jewish. It's mostly German, but it has, for example, some Hebrew and other loanwords to it. The Jews of Germany and Central Europe were Ashkenazi, so different ethnicity than Sephardic Jews, even though they're equally Jewish and equally in the rabbinic Jewish tradition, religiously speaking. And the Ashkenazi did have different rituals, though, that they used in their synagogues, and they originated probably around the 16th century AD. In Eastern Europe, most of the European Jews lived in Poland, Lithuania. These were originally two kingdoms who, at some points, were combined together. It was a very large kingdom, as you can see in this map, although the king wasn't super powerful. A lot of the power was in the hands of the aristocrats. So it was a sort of not very carefully united or closely united kingdom. And in that respect, they were somewhat similar to the Holy Roman Empire to the west. Um, the Eastern European Jews, even though they were not living in predominantly German-speaking lands for the most part, because many of them had migrated from Germany and Central Europe, they spoke Yiddish. And this continued up until modern times. The rulers of Poland, Lithuania, and other Eastern European kingdoms often welcomed the Jews because they were economically very important. But there were often anti-Jewish riots, especially among the common people who associated the Jews with the kings or other rulers over them. In Italy, in this time, Jews continued to be segregated in ghettos, and there were severe penalties inflicted on them. So a lot of persecution still happening in parts of Western Europe. In the 17th century, there were some messianic movements among Jews. Specifically, Shabbatai Zevi was proclaimed as Messiah by Nathan of Gaza, who kind of functioned as his prophet. And Nathan called for repentance, for asceticism, and mortification of the flesh, such as through fasting, bathing in freezing water, and constant prayer. So he had a lot of followers. He was very popular for a while. People thought that he was the Messiah who would restore the kingdom of Israel and the Jewish people. But things fell apart after he was imprisoned by the Ottomans in 1665. And under pressure, he converted to Islam in 1666. So most of his followers left him, and those few who continued to follow him were viewed very negatively by other Jews. And arguably, this incident had a large influence on causing a lot of Jews to turn away from Messianism and no longer even expecting or hoping the Messiah will come or return in practical terms, even though they might still hope for it in some kind of more abstract or theoretical way. Hasidic Judaism emerged in 18th century Poland. It was a popular movement with emphasis on emotion and devotion. It gave hope to Jews who were deprived or frightened by the periodic persecutions. It also promised individual and direct experience of the divine, so it was accessible to people like common laborers who couldn't afford to spend long hours in study of the Torah, which was previously normative in most circles of rabbinic Judaism. Hasidic Jews emphasize ecstatic prayer, singing, and dancing, and joy born of individual contact or experience of the divine. The Baal Shem Tov was an important leader in early Hasidic Judaism. His title, Baal Shem Tov, means master of the good name, and his name was originally Israel ben Eliezer. So he worked miracles, he was charismatic and dynamic. He was also influenced by Kabbalah, especially the Zohar, and this is one of the reasons why Hasidic Jews today and Judaism generally still has a kind of prominent place for the Kabbalah because of its role within the history of Hasidic Judaism. The term Rebbe or Zadik is used for Hasidic leaders, and they're very important for their communities. They're supposed to live a life of devotion, and they function as an intermediary between their followers and God. Their word is regarded as absolute. There are many branches of Hasidism, such as Chabad, but in all of them, women tend to be subservient and to lead separate lives from the men. Hasidism was opposed at the time by the Jewish establishment, so there's kind of a class struggle between the leaders of Hasidic Judaism, or the Rebbes, and the more rich and learned Jews of the day. For example, the Gaon of Vilna, Elijah ben Solomon, was an Hasidic intellectual who criticized Hasidism. But Hasidic Jews were sometimes excluded or betrayed to the authorities. They still survived, though, as a community. Shneur Zalman of Liadi founded the Chabad branch of Hasidic Judaism, which is still quite influential today. And one of his ideas was to reconcile the new movement of Hasidism with study of the Talmud. And so this became very widely accepted among Hasidic Jews generally. So the Jews, for a lot of their history, were migrating out of Europe because of persecution, such as eastward migration from Germany into Eastern Europe, Poland, Lithuania, etc., and into the Ottoman Empire from Spain. But there eventually was movement west as well. In 1492, after the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, many of them moved to Amsterdam in the Netherlands and later to England, or some of them moved to the Spanish colonies in the New World. In the 17th century and after, there was a westward migration of some Jews from Poland and the Ottoman Empire, as they sought more opportunities in Western Europe, for example. And many rulers welcomed Jewish immigrants because of their economic value. So this is another theme in the history of the Jews. They were often valued by rulers, even though they'd be systematically persecuted, whether by the rulers or by the common people. In the 19th century, many Jews started immigrating to the US and other countries in the Americas, including in Latin America and Mexico. And Jews in many Western nations finally became equal under the law. This was referred to as emancipation. So, under the traditional legal systems, especially before the time of Napoleon and much of Europe, there were different laws that governed Jews rather than Christians. And that didn't end until the 19th century in most places. In the 18th century, there was a movement in Western Europe known as the Enlightenment. It's difficult to simply summarize. It had a lot of aspects to it. It was a cultural, literary, artistic, political movement. It advocated science, reason, and freedom of thought, as opposed to, for example, just accepting tradition, the authority of the church, things like that. They wanted people to think for themselves. They wanted people to use scientific investigation to discover the truth. This had a big influence on the founding of the United States, but also just European, Western, and now modern culture generally. The Enlightenment figures tended to support different types of political liberalism. Um, Not many of them probably would have supported what's considered liberalism today, or at least not progressivism, although some of the Enlightenment figures like Rousseau kind of prefigure that. But they were rejecting the traditions of like monarchy, aristocracy, a lot of the traditional governments of Europe, and even if they supported monarchy, they tended to support constitutional or limited monarchy, where there's some voice for the common people, maybe even for the aristocrats too, but where you don't have power concentrated in the hands of the king or concentrated in the hereditary aristocracy and not at all in the common people. So they had various political reforms that they proposed, but they were basically united in their opposition to tradition. Um, and they also supported things like equality under the law, as opposed to different laws for different classes of people or different religions. And in terms of the arts, they were supporting the neoclassical revival, so reviving styles architecturally and artistically of ancient Greece and Rome, for example. At this time, there was also a Jewish enlightenment called the Haskalah, so part of the general movement, but kind of applying some of the ideas to Judaism. The most famous individual of this movement was Moses Mendelssohn. He was a German Jewish intellectual who lived from 1729 to 1786. He advocated the separation of church and state, which many of the Enlightenment reformers also recommended. Previously, in most kingdoms in Europe, if not all, there was a relation between the king and the church, and so there'd be an official established church. Originally in Western Europe, it was always the Catholic Church, but after the Protestant Reformation, starting in the 1500s, there were other churches too, like the Dutch Reformed Church in the Netherlands, and the Presbyterian Church in Scotland, and Lutheran Church in some German states. But in the Enlightenment, people started to argue no, there should be religious freedom for the individual, and the state should not support one church over the other. And Moses Mendelssohn promoted that, and I think in part the thinking at the time was that this would also help promote toleration for Jews, because there wouldn't be one religion favored by the government over others. And Jews were in a minority across Europe, so the idea is that could benefit them. He also emphasized the universal principles within Judaism and sought to make Jews identify not only as Jews, but also as kind of like humans or citizens of their nation, and that other citizens of the nation might find common ground from within some of the ethical ideas of Judaism. He translated the Torah into German. Previously, it was only studied in Hebrew. And another example of the Jewish Enlightenment was Leopold Zunz, who rejected the Talmud and many traditional ideas, even the idea of revelation. So you can see the kind of radical edge to the Enlightenment movement, both the Jewish Enlightenment, but in general, it caused many people, both within Judaism and in Christianity, to reject a lot of the traditional teachings of their religions. But these Enlightenment Jews, they didn't really want to reject their Jewish identity entirely. Rather, I think they kind of wanted to modernize it or reform it, make it both more rational, but also easier to fit in or assimilate with the broader Christian culture. In the 19th century is when many Jews were emancipated and, for example, no longer being forced to live in a ghetto. The picture on the slide shows Napoleon. It's a propaganda poster that he created, emancipating the Jews of France and other Jews under his control. And this practice kind of spread throughout Europe, in part through the conquest of Napoleon in the early 1800s. And this had a huge impact on Jewish life. So many Jews, for example, began to assimilate and even to marry non-Jews. Later on in the 19th century, there arose Reform Judaism, which we'll talk about more later, but it basically abandoned some of the practices and traditional beliefs of Judaism while still retaining the religion in some manner and Jewish identity. Later on in the 19th century, there started to grow some really anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish racial philosophies. In part, these were influenced by the Romantic movement, which followed the Enlightenment movement. Basically, the Romantic movement started at the end of the Enlightenment movement. So, I mean, there's overlap between them, but, like very late 1700s, early 1800s is when the Romantics are getting more influence. And they're, in a way, in tune with the Enlightenment in the sense of rejecting tradition or certain aspects of it. And often supporting political reforms and religious reforms, but they don't just prioritize reason and science. They believe in emotion, they believe in intuition, they believe in, for example, the soul or spirit of a people or culture, called Volksgeist in German. And rather than the Enlightenment ideal of a common humanity united with the common reason and a common science and even a common political order, the Romantics thought that no, each culture, which basically they defined primarily as a linguistic community, has its own soul or spirit, and they have to have their own institutions, their own way of life that's going to be proper for them. And some of these people had a racial dimension to their philosophy, that each people is not just a language community, but a race, and people of other races are inferior. So many of them were anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish for that reason. And they would contrast the Jewish race with those of the Aryans. The Aryans were actually an ancient ethnic group who migrated to India, originally from Central Asia. Some of them migrated to Persia or Iran, other parts of the Middle East. But in the 1800s, the Europeans developing these kind of racialist philosophies, they had kind of a distorted notion of who the Aryans were. They thought they were the ancestors of all Europeans or the white race, and they kind of conflated them as speakers of an ancient Indo-European language with the ancestors of later Europeans. So it's kind of a distorted view there. But anyway, that was how a lot of these racialists self-identified. They thought of their race as Aryans, or like in Eastern Europe, in the Slavic-speaking countries, a lot of them had this idea of the Slavic or Slavonic culture or race and how it was superior, or at least it was their tradition that they wanted to prioritize. So there were extreme forms of anti-Semitism developing in France and Germany, especially in the late 1800s. Kind of like the racialist philosophies get more extreme. And then some of those fed into Nazism and the ideology of Adolf Hitler and others in Germany in the 1920s and after. And some of those ways of thinking and being biased against Jews contributed to the ideology behind the Holocaust, where millions of Jews were killed in the 1930s and 40s. Chapter 31, Sacred Writings. So we've done a historical overview of Judaism and talked a lot about their scriptures along the way, but now we're going to explain some of the different types of scriptures used and other texts used in Judaism more systematically. Judaism is often called a scriptural religion, so the scriptures are of central importance, and this was a trend that was already happening even before the destruction of the Second Temple, because there was already like a diaspora of Jews in Babylon and other Jews in other places that had to use the scripture as their main source of tradition and identity. But especially after the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD by the Romans, the scripture of the Torah became the main focus of the religion and the main commonality that all Jews share. You can also see the importance of scripture, though, even before that, like with King Josiah's reforms, the book of the law, the notion that what it means to be a Jew is to follow the commandments that are in the Torah. And these commandments were given by God to Moses, and that was like the establishment of the Jewish people, or originally the Israelite people, but then the Jews were the main remnant or survivors of that ancient people. And so, yeah, even in antiquity, scribes were regarded as heroes or great men, and later as the ones with the authority to teach the Torah, to be rabbis. But yeah, after the destruction of the temple, this trend intensified. And if you look at modern halachot or observances, they include rules about the proper treatment of books. So showing you how books in general, but especially the Torah or other parts of the Bible, the Tanakh, are treated as sacred objects in themselves. So you can divide the Jewish scriptures and related texts into three main parts. The Tanakh is what we normally think of as the Jewish or the Hebrew Bible, and includes the Torah, but other writings and books as well. And the Mishnah is a series of tractates and regulations on the law, so a development of the law originally revealed in the Torah. And the Talmud is a lot of commentary or exposition on both the Torah and the Mishnah. So first, let's start with the Tanakh. It consists of the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. So the three main consonants of Tanakh, T, N, and K, are from those three words. It's kind of like an abbreviation. So the Torah is the oldest part. It's the 5 books of Moses that Jews believe were revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai by God: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So Genesis is the story of the origin of the world and of the first Jewish patriarchs. Exodus is the story of the Jews' liberation from slavery in Egypt and journeying across the wilderness to the Promised Land. It also describes the revelation to Moses on Mount Sinai and has a lot of the covenants and laws in there. Leviticus is the original book of the law that has all of the commandments that the Jews are supposed to follow. Numbers includes a recitation of the ancient tribes of Israel and their various members, hence Numbers, but other material as well. And Deuteronomy, or the second law, was a second, possibly later or additional book of the law, allegedly discovered by King Josiah in the walls of the temple, possibly just authored under his reign in the kingdom of Judah. The Nevi'im, or prophets, are divided into 2 parts. So these were a series of books by prophets, or recording the words of prophets that Jews believed were inspired by God and giving them messages and revelations, including in the period after the Babylonian captivity. The former prophets are the ones before the Babylonian captivity. These are Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. The latter prophets are the ones after, and they're divided into major and minor. The major latter prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. And the minor latter prophets are Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And then the last part of the Tanakh is the Ketuvim, which means writings. And these include various books of different genres, including the Psalms, or the songs and hymns attributed to King David, Proverbs, or wise sayings, the book of Job, the Song of Songs, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. So these are a variety of different texts. Many of them are important, though, like in the Jewish liturgy. Esther is used, for example, in the festival of Purim. Other uses of the word Torah, apart from the first part of the Tanakh, it can refer more generally to the Tanakh as a whole. It can also refer to the oral Torah, or the teachings given orally to Moses by God, but not written down. According to rabbinic belief, these teachings do go back to Moses, even though they weren't written down until much later. And they contain the ethical teachings of the later rabbis as well. So the Megillot are 5 books from the writings that are read cyclically during Jewish festivals. So like Ruth, for example, is read at the Harvest Festival. So how was this canon of rabbinic Judaism formed? It was not really closed until after the destruction of the Second Temple, with the development of rabbinic Judaism. So I mentioned the Sadducees and the Pharisees before. This was before the destruction of the Second Temple. The Sadducees were the class or sect of the priests and other elites who patronized them or were part of their class. They controlled the sacrifices at the temple in Jerusalem, so they tend to be wealthier, more influential in terms of just social status. They only accepted the Torah as scripture. They knew about the writings and the prophets, but they didn't regard them as part of their canon. However, with the destruction of the temple, that class or sect of Judaism was basically destroyed or at least disbanded. And the Pharisees, their view ended up growing into rabbinic Judaism. And they regarded the writings and the prophets as canon, which is why they were included in the rabbinic Jewish canon still used by Jews today. However, the rabbinic edition of the Tanakh did omit some books previously collected in the older Septuagint or Greek translation of the ancient Hebrew Tanakh. And those are the books that you find, for example, in Catholic and Orthodox Christian Bibles in the Old Testament, but not in Protestant Bibles. Protestant Bibles use the rabbinic canon as their Old Testament and not some of those other books like 1st and 2nd Maccabees, for example. And there's other ones too, and the so-called deuterocanonical books. So the Mishnah is collections of tractates consisting of halachot, which are observances. And these are basically rules of conduct that cover every conceivable area of daily life and various types of ritual purity. They were developed around 200 AD. Now, there's also midrash, which are commentaries on the halachot, and those began to be composed around 250 to 300 AD. The first tractate of the Mishnah is the Pirkei Avot, or sayings of the fathers. And this begins with general principles for interpretation and practice. The first verse of this is famous. Quote, Moses received the Torah from Sinai and passed it on to Joshua, and Joshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets passed it on to the men of the great assembly. They said 3 things. Be careful in giving judgment, raise up many disciples, and make a fence around the Torah, end quote. And that last principle, make a fence around the Torah, is interesting. One way of interpreting it is that you want to make sure not only that you follow the Torah and protect it, but that you maybe want to create additional rules or procedures to just make it very unlikely that you would accidentally or some other way violate the original rules of the Torah. So you see a kind of increasing maybe proliferation or complexity or strictness of rules and rulings that come out of this tradition, partly inspired by this principle of being very careful to not ever even suggest that you might be violating the Torah. So yeah, Jews nowadays regard following the Mishnah as necessary for following the Torah. Even though it wasn't part of the original text, it's just as important for them practically speaking. And they have a belief that if you guard and protect the Torah, it will ensure that the Torah guards you. The Talmud means teaching, and this is a collection of many writings containing the teaching of rabbis of the diaspora about the meaning and implementation of both the Tanakh and the Mishnah. There were 2 main Talmuds, the Palestinian or Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. The Jerusalem Talmud is a record of the discussion in the rabbinic schools of Galilee, especially that of Tiberias during the 4th century AD. So it was widely used by Jews in Italy and Egypt. The Babylonian Talmud contains the opinions of more than 1,000 rabbis, initially written in the period between 200 and 650 AD. So in other words, this is in the crucial centuries of formation of Rabbinic Judaism. Although the Babylonian Talmud was compiled a bit later in the 7th to 8th centuries AD, and it was used by Jews living in the Muslim Empire or Caliphate. This one is even longer than the Jerusalem Talmud, around 4 million words long. So the Talmud contains many kinds of writings and a diversity of views. Because it's such a diverse collection of texts, functionally it blurs the distinction between the sacred and the profane. These writings cover all areas of life. And interestingly, the Talmud is concerned with questions and the process of answering them, not only with giving a single definitive answer that all rabbis or all Jews might be expected to agree on. There's a story that kind of illustrates this aspect of the Talmud, the story of Rabbi Eliezer. So Rabbi Eliezer gave this interpretation, and there were signs from heaven, apparently from God himself, that appeared to support his interpretation. But the other rabbis still disagreed, and they still questioned him. So Rabbi Nathan asked the prophet Elijah, what was the Holy One, that's a reference to God, blessed be he, doing in that hour? And Elijah said, he was laughing and saying, my children have defeated me, my children have defeated me. So the way that this is interpreted is that God is saying, my children, these other rabbis with differing interpretations than God, have defeated him. In other words, that God himself sort of laughs at or doesn't condemn wholeheartedly or single-mindedly questioning even of an interpretation that might be regarded as authoritative. So the spirit of questioning is part of the point of Talmud. There are other texts too that are important for Jews. These are some of the main examples. There are targums or biblical paraphrases. So Jews do read the Torah or the Tanakh itself, but just as often or more frequently, they read other texts, whether from Talmud or like these targums or commentaries on the Torah. An example of a very important commentary is the Mishneh Torah or copy of the Torah by Maimonides. There's also commentaries by Rashi and Abraham ibn Ezra. The Zohar, that work of Kabbalah, is very influential. And there's a text called the Shulchan Aruch, which is a compilation from around the year 1565 of Jewish law. So how to view this great diversity of writings and their relation to each other? The basic view is that there is a kind of hierarchy or priority. The Tanakh was the foundation of the Mishnah and the Midrash, and the Tanakh and the Mishnah were the foundation for the Talmud. So you can also see this hierarchy within the Tanakh itself, starting with the Torah, then the prophets, then the writings, and then you have the non-Tanakh or extra canonical works, starting with the Mishnah, then the Talmud, and the Midrash. Chapter 32, Beliefs. So it's difficult to summarize the beliefs of Judaism. We're just going to try to hit some of the main points here. So what is the Jewish view of God? Well, they were one of the first peoples in the Middle East, probably the world, to practice monolatry, only worshiping one God. And at some point, perhaps early on, perhaps later, they developed the view, the belief of monotheism, that only one God actually exists. So the other gods are either not real at all, or maybe they're demons or other spirits like angels that are improperly identified as gods. But regardless, they're not gods. The only one God exists. And there's names of God that are used by Jews. El, which is ancient Hebrew for God. The Tetragrammaton, which perhaps may have been pronounced Yahweh. It was considered sacrilege for anyone to say this except the high priest in the Holy of Holies in the temple 1 day per year. And the Holy of Holies is the inner sanctum or sanctuary, the place where only the high priest was allowed to go. The word Adonai or Lord is used by Jews in place of the Tetragrammaton, so as not to say the name. In the picture, by the way, is the Ark of the Covenant, well, a modern artist reconstruction of it. The description of the Ark is there in Exodus in the Hebrew Bible. And the two angelic-like beings are supposed to be cherubim. These probably are not exactly how the ancient cherubim looked, but maybe something similar. The point is, though, that there's no depiction of God himself in the Holy of Holies where the Ark was stored. And why not? Well, there's a prohibition in Judaism against creating a graven image or an icon of God. That's considered sacrilege. That's considering reducing God to the material. I mean, there's many interpretations of it, but God is regarded as transcendent and thus not picturable in human form. Although, if you read some of the prophets, some of the visions, for example, of Ezekiel or Daniel, sometimes there's a glowing human-like figure that is seen by the prophets, and that might be interpreted as the body or the person of God. But in Judaism generally, there's the view that God doesn't literally have a human body, or at least if he did, you wouldn't want to picture it and worship it, because then you'd be worshiping an idol and not God himself. And in general, God is thought of as transcending anything, merely physical, like a body. You can see this idea of the unity and oneness of God in the Shema prayer, which goes, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord." And that's from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 to 9. So in Judaism, God is regarded as the creator of heaven, earth, and humanity, and that humans are created in some sense in the image of God. And so there's a kind of oneness not only to God, but also to humanity and to the world as all being the creation of God. But God is thought to transcend the creation. God is uncreated and doesn't depend on anything else for his existence. And that's a major difference between him and everything else, because the world and humanity do depend on God for their existence. And you can see this notion of the transcendence of God, for example, in Isaiah's description, Isaiah the prophet. Despite his transcendence, God is also often described as omnipresent in the creation. And later Jews, this is outside the Torah, but described this as the Shekinah, or the indwelling presence of God in the creation. So a bit more about the Shekinah. This concept developed during the period of Rabbinic Judaism. You can see in the Midrash, which was paraphrasing Numbers chapter 6, verse 25, quote, "The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you," unquote. And quote, "May he give thee of the light of the Shekinah," unquote. Also, Saadia Gaon said that the Shekinah is identical with the glory of God, and that it serves as an intermediary between God and humans. Another possible illustration of this is the pillar of cloud and flame, which guided and accompanied the Israelites when they were wandering for 40 years in the wilderness before reaching the promised land. And that could be interpreted as indicating the presence of God, and thus perhaps the Shekinah during the Exodus. Judah Halevi of Toledo in his Kuzari said that it's the Shekinah rather than God himself who appears to the prophets. Sometimes the Shekinah is described or conceived as feminine as well. So the Jews also believe that God is eternal and has no beginning, no end, and is outside of time in some sense. The Talmud says there's an unbridgeable gap between God and humans. The Midrash also affirms the eternity of God's reign, but discourages speculation about this eternity. The Mishnah says, quote, "Whoever reflects on four things, it were better for him that he had not come into the world. What is above? What is beneath? What is before? And what is after?" End quote. Maimonides, in his Guide for the Perplexed, argued that time itself is part of the creation. And so God did not exist before the creation because the concept of time did not apply. Joseph Albo, in his Ikarim from the 15th century, says that terms that indicate a duration or a location in time cannot be applied to God. Temporal concepts can only be applied to God in a negative sense. So God is not non-existent before, during, or after a particular time. Some Jewish thinkers say that God is outside time, in an eternal now, and that God experiences all the past, present, and future of the created world simultaneously and eternally. Now, I couldn't find a picture to illustrate this concept of eternity directly, so rather I just included, for the interest of history, a possible depiction of the God of the Israelites, Adonai or El or Yahweh, from an ancient coin from the region. You can see he's sitting on a wheel with a wing, And when prophets describe visions of God in the Hebrew Bible, it is often a figure like this, seated on a chariot. And often God's messengers or angels are depicted as winged beings. So there's kind of a connection there in the iconography or the visual imagery of the prophets and some of these ancient artifacts. God is regarded as omnipotent or all-powerful and as omniscient by Jews. An example of God's power: when Abraham's wife Sarah was able to conceive Isaac despite being very old. Maimonides, in his Guide for the Perplexed, says that God cannot do anything logically impossible, contradictory, like make a circle a square, but everything else is fair game, including miracles. God is regarded as being omniscient or all-knowing, and his knowledge is regarded as not limited by space and time. For example, Psalms 33:13 says, "The Lord looks down from heaven. He sees all the sons of men." And chapter 33, verse 15 says, "He who fashions the hearts of them all and observes all their deeds." So in other words, God looks down from heaven. He sees everything. He knows everything. And that God has foreknowledge of all events. But Jews still believe that humans have free will. In the Mishnah, it says, quote, "All is foreseen, but freedom of choice is given," end quote. Maimonides says that humans are unable to comprehend the nature of God's knowledge because it's of a different kind from that of humans. Humans are unable to understand how divine foreknowledge is compatible with free will, for example, but nevertheless, it is. Jews regard Israel, and thus the Jewish people, as being elected or chosen by God and as having a sacred mission. And this is a part of the larger concept of Hashgaha, or divine providence or guidance of the universe. God controls and guides the universe, as it says in Psalms 33, verse 14, quote, "From where he sits enthroned, he looks forth on all the inhabitants of the earth," end quote. God serves as a judge of the world. He decides the destiny both of individuals and of nations. So the idea of Jews, and in antiquity of all Israelites, as the chosen people of God is really central to the Jewish understanding of the faith. That Jews have a special job, this role, to worship God, to praise him, to honor him, and to kind of serve as an example thereby for all nations. Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 6 says, quote, "For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his own possession out of all the peoples that are on the face of the earth," end quote. And Genesis chapter 18, verse 19 says, Israel has a mission to, quote, "keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice," end quote. So there's different views in Judaism of how the different parts of the Tanakh were revealed. They all basically come from God, but the mechanism, you might say, is a bit different in each case. So the Torah, those are the first 5 books that are believed to have been revealed by God directly to Moses. So through a direct divine appearance or manifestation, a theophany, to use the Greek. And rabbinic Jews believe that God directly revealed both the written Torah and the oral Torah, or these traditions that weren't written down until the time of rabbinic Judaism, to Moses on Mount Sinai. The prophets part of the Tanakh, in contrast, were given by means of prophecy rather than direct revelation. So in other words, there wasn't necessarily a direct visible or audible manifestation of God in the creation, you might say, like a theophany, but rather things like visionary experiences. And the writings were conveyed in still a third mechanism by means of the Holy Spirit rather than by prophecy. So kind of spiritual inspiration by God, if you will. And the oral Torah is different still. So it contains expositions and elaborations of the written law that were revealed by God to Moses. So that part is connected to the mechanism of revelation with Torah. But it also contains additional legislation developed and transmitted through many generations of rabbis. Mitzvot means commandments. God revealed 613 commandments to Moses in the Torah according to Rabbinic Judaism. So there are two main types of mitzvot: ritual performances, you could say, and ritual laws. Ritual performances are obligations between humans and God, so they're very kind of specific to the revelation. Whereas ritual laws are things that would have been adopted by society even if they had not been decreed by God. And that includes things like, don't kill. Mitzvot, Mishnah, and Talmud are all binding on all Jews for all time, according to Rabbinic Judaism. So they have an equal status in that regard. Despite the clarity of the commandments and the clarity of the role of the Jews as God's chosen people, it's described, even going back to the Torah itself, that many Jews have struggled or failed to follow all the commandments. Like even during the period where they were revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai, a lot of the Jews in the wilderness started worshiping other gods, the idol of the golden calf, and otherwise not following the commandments. And this continued happening for centuries after as well, where they would worship foreign gods like Moloch or Baal or Asherah. So this idea that it's hard to follow the commandments and there's a kind of struggle within the human soul or within human nature in this way corresponds to these two concepts of Rabbinic Judaism. The Yetzer HaTov is the good inclination we have, all of us, which would make it easier to follow the commandments, and the Yetzer Hara is the evil inclination that leads us to violate them. Eschatology is the theory of the afterlife or the end of the world or the end of time. The Jewish eschatology, going back to the prophets, is that at the end of time, God will send the Messiah, an anointed one or king, to restore the kingdom of Israel, save the Jews from their enemies, and usher in a new age, the Messianic age. And Isaiah and other prophets of the Tanakh predicted that the Messiah would come. In the Midrashim and the Babylonian Talmud, the rabbis developed an elaborate eschatological scheme or system divided into several stages. First, there'd be a long age of decline and calamity. Then the Messiah would come and there'd be the Messianic age. In this time, it would be kind of like an ideal golden age. Every wish would be fulfilled and the city of Jerusalem would be rebuilt. But finally, the Messianic age would come to an end. But then after that, the dead would be resurrected and there'd be a final judgment on all humans. The righteous would enter heaven, or Gan Eden in Hebrew, and the wicked will be condemned to everlasting punishment in hell, or Gehinnom. In the picture, you see the prophet Samuel anointing King David. The future Messiah is not the same person as King David, but the idea is he would be an anointed one in the same sense, echoing the custom of the ancient kingdom of Israel. In modern times, many Jews have different beliefs than the traditional eschatology. Since the 19th century, many Jews have questioned some of those traditional beliefs. So many modern Jews, for example, are skeptical or remain agnostic about whether there will be a Messiah or an end time with a general resurrection and judgment. Some Jews use the phrase "when the Messiah comes" as a way of saying never, or probably never. And this may be due to disappointment after many previous failed messiahs, such as Bar Kokhba in antiquity and Sabbatai Zevi later on. Reform Judaism generally rejects literal interpretations of some parts of Scripture and abandons some of the Jewish commandments or other traditions. Reconstructionist Judaism and humanistic Judaism are more liberal still, and they generally reject all supernatural elements of the Jewish tradition, which of course would include the Messiah and the traditional eschatology. The Holocaust as well apparently affected the views of some Jews because it was such a traumatic experience. The mass killing of millions of Jews by the Nazi regime under Adolf Hitler caused many Jews to question divine providence or even the very existence of God. But it must be said, even though many Jews are secular or of a more reformed theology or set of beliefs, many Jews remain Orthodox. And within the modern nation state of Israel, Orthodox rabbis actually have the religious authority. Like, for example, they have the authority to determine who is a Jew and who is not. And in terms of birth rates, Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jews have higher birth rates than secular or non-Orthodox Jews. And thus, they're actually growing as a share of the population in Israel. So their interpretations of the religion may have an influence in the future as well. Chapter 33, Worship and Festivals. The heart of Judaism is certain practices, like keeping Shabbat or the Sabbath, and performing certain festivals. And that's how many or most Jews live their religion. There's a major, or at least a significant, Jewish festival almost every month of the year. And the cycle of festivals as a whole reenacts the history of the Jews telling their story, and thus allows Jews today to connect with their religion, their culture, their tradition. In Maimonides' 13 Principles of the Faith, he identifies three main themes of Judaism: creation, revelation, and redemption. And Jews think that humans can bring God into the world through their everyday actions, and that humans are called to be partners with God in the task of creation, or in the idea of repairing creation. The Babylonian Talmud in Shabbat 10a, 119b, Sanhedrin 38a, says that the supreme moment of revelation is when Moses received the commandments, or the mitzvot, on Mount Sinai. In other words, identifying that as the heart of the religion. Halakha means following the mitzvot, the commandments, thus walking in God's way. In the picture is candles and challah, or braided bread, that are performed every Shabbat or Sabbath. So this is a very common way for Jews to routinely encounter or interact with their faith. So basically every Friday evening, to mark the beginning of the Sabbath, they light their candles at home and they have the bread and wine for Shabbat. So there are ceremonies performed both in the home and in synagogue for Jews. The Shabbat or Sabbath is the day of rest where no work is allowed. It begins Friday evening because of the traditional Jewish custom that a day begins at dusk, and then this ends Saturday evening. So Jews will attend their synagogue Friday evening after dusk. The synagogues are referred to as shul or schools because they originated as places for Torah study. So one of the important elements in every synagogue is a Sefer Torah, or scroll of the law, which is held in a protective ark and removed during a service to be read from. So there are many practices connected to the synagogue, but that's one of the important ones. Home practices include following all the dietary laws or keeping kosher. So for example, separating meat from dairy, not consuming certain types of meat like pork. Shabbat ceremonies include lighting candles and reciting blessings over the wine and bread. And then there's the festivals, some parts of which are celebrated at home, like the Seder or meal for Passover. And children often take part in these practices, especially in the home. For example, during the Purim festival, children yell to drown out the name of Haman whenever it's spoken in the story that's being recited. During Passover, a child is tasked with asking the questions at the Seder that help illustrate the meaning of the Passover. In Hanukkah, children are often closest to the lights of the menorah when they're lit. There are three main festivals in Judaism called the pilgrimage festivals because in antiquity, when the temple still stood, these were the times when all Jews were supposed to go to the temple to make sacrifices. Pesach, or Passover, lasts for 8 days, and the days listed there are in the Jewish calendar, which is lunar. So it's the month of Nisan, the days the 15th to the 21st or 22nd. So Pesach commemorates the exodus from Egypt under Moses and celebrates the passage from slavery to freedom for the Jews. The Seder, or the Passover meal, is on the first evening of the Passover festival. It's a family meal with a retelling of the story of the Exodus that involves a reading from the Haggadah, or the telling. And there are many symbolic elements of the Seder, one example of which is the matzot, or the unleavened breads that are eaten, which is a reflection of the fact that the Jews had to flee Egypt so quickly they did not allow their bread to rise with yeast. The picture has a Seder table setting which shows a lot of the foods consumed as part of the Passover Seder. In the ancient temple, then Jews would go and make an animal sacrifice as a way of expiating their sin. Shavuot, or Pentecost, is in the month of Sivan, the 6th day, and it marks the beginning of the bringing of the first fruits to the temple. So this would be a harvest festival where the first fruits gotten from the field would be taken as offerings to the god, a kind of thanksgiving. It celebrates the giving of the Torah by God to Moses on Mount Sinai. Sukkot, or Tabernacles, is an 8-day festival, days 15 to 20 of the month of Tishrei. It commemorates God's protection of the Israelites in the desert during the Exodus. So you can see all of these festivals related to the Exodus and the revelation of the Torah to Moses. That right there is the heart of Judaism in a way, and the heart of Jewish identity. Rosh Hashanah is days 1 to 2 of the month of Tishrei. It's the New Year festival. It's part of a 40-day period of penitence. And Rosh Hashanah marks the beginning of the last 10 days of the 40-day penitence, called the 10 days of Ah, or Yamim Noraim. So there's a New Year's Eve meal that includes foods associated with sweetness, blessings, and plenty. Bread, for example, is dipped in honey rather than in salt. And there's a prayer for Rosh Hashanah, quote, "May it be your will to renew for us a good and sweet year," end quote. The morning service on New Year's Day includes up to 6 hours of prayer, and it's focused on God as the creator, king, and judge. God will show mercy to those who sincerely turn toward him. So there's this idea of a turning towards God. The shofar, or ram's horn, is blown throughout the service to act as a wake-up call. Yom Kippur is on the 10th day of Tishrei, and this is the Day of Atonement, and it marks the end of the 10 days of awe. This is regarded as the holiest day of the Jewish liturgical year. Jews will solemnly review their conduct over the past year, and then turn to face the new year. The day is spent in prayer for forgiveness and for a good year ahead. The word teshuvah means return to God, a renewed commitment to follow God's commandments. The Kol Nidre is a declaration in Aramaic. It's sung during the beginning of the synagogue service, and it's often very solemn but very beautiful affair. There are prohibitions for Yom Kippur. You're not allowed to work, just like on the Shabbat. And there's also the Inuyim, 5 additional prohibitions. You're supposed to abstain from eating and drinking, anointing with oil, sex, washing for pleasure, and wearing leather shoes. And then there's the Ne'ilah, or the closing of the gates. This is the final service on Yom Kippur as the fast ends. It symbolizes the last hour in which the gates of heaven remain open for people to return to God. The Avinu Malkeinu, or Our Father, Our King, is chanted to express commitment to God, and there's a final blow of the shofar. And then there are several minor festivals in Judaism. Hanukkah is celebrated from 25 Kislev to 2 Tevet, and it commemorates the rededication of the temple in 165 BC after it was defiled by the Greek king Antiochus IV. And this was the rededication under the Maccabees, the founders of the Hasmonean kingdom. And there was a miracle during this rededication, because when rededicating the temple, the Hasmoneans could only find enough lamp oil to light the menorah, or candelabra, in the temple for 1 day, and yet the oil they found burned for 8 days. And so it's an 8-day festival, and an additional light on the home menorah is lit on each night of the festival. There's also the festival of Purim on the 14th of Adar. It commemorates an event after the destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians, but before the second temple was built. So this is during the Babylonian captivity, in other words. Haman schemed with the king of Persia, King Ahasuerus, to kill many Jews. But he was basically outwitted by Esther and her uncle Mordecai. They were used by God to prevent the massacre. This is a very joyous celebration with parties and gifts and costumes and noisemakers and various kinds of mirth and revelry. The Megillah, or the scroll that has the book of Esther and 4 other books in it, is read aloud in the synagogue. In the picture is hamantashen, or hats of Haman, that are consumed during the Purim festival. This may actually date back to an earlier custom of consuming triangle-shaped bread to honor a fertility goddess in ancient Canaan. This is speculative, but it's entirely possible. And then the breads, the sweet breads, were kind of reinterpreted to go with the story of Esther and Haman. Although Esther herself, her name is kind of similar to some ancient goddesses. So it's not that Jews are, worshiping a goddess in this festival, but rather it may have been inspired or as a reaction against older goddess worship, a kind of Jewish version that fits the theology and traditions of the religion. And there are other fast days as well in Judaism. Tisha B'Av is the 9th day of the month of Av, and it commemorates the destruction of both the first temple in 586 BC and of the second temple in 70 AD. And it can also be taken to commemorate other tragedies in the history of Judaism. Reformed Jews, for example, often use this date to commemorate the Holocaust. Now, on Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av, Jews fast for 25 hours rather than the 24 hours that's required for their other fast days. And in Judaism, fasts include abstaining not only from food, but also from any drink, including water. Chapter 34, Branches of Judaism. So Jews can be defined along ethnic lines. Jewish identity is a bit complicated because it's both an ethnicity and also a religion. Historically speaking, this was pretty common because if you go back to most ancient cultures, an ethnicity or a culture or a tribe or a nation was coterminous with both a language and a religious tradition. But with the rise of missionary religions starting in the first few centuries BC, like Buddhism, Christianity, and then Islam, the idea of having a ethnic identity correspond to a religious identity became much weaker because the religions were deliberately spreading themselves out to other ethnic groups. But Judaism is both an ethnic identity and a religion. Non-ethnic Jews can convert to the religion. Not all people of Jewish ancestry are religious in the Jewish sense. And also, despite the fact that Jews are a common ethnic group in some sense, there are different types of Jews that can be divided along ethnic lines. So the main types of Jewish ethnicities are named on the slide: Sephardim, Ashkenazim, Mizrahim, and Beta Israel. There are others as well, but these are probably the biggest ones. So Sephardim, or Sephardic Jews, are Spanish Jews. They're named after Sepharad, which was a Jewish name for Spain. Traditionally, they spoke the Ladino language, which was derived from Spanish. They were driven out of Spain in 1492 by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain. And many of them settled in the Ottoman Empire. Some of them settled, as mentioned previously, in Amsterdam or other parts of Europe. The Ashkenazim were from France and Germany originally. Then they moved further to the east to Poland, Lithuania, Russia, and other parts of Eastern and Central Europe. In Russia, there was a part of the kingdom or empire called the Pale of Settlement. These were in Western Russia, and they were the only territories where Jews were allowed to settle legally. The word Ashkenazim, or Ashkenazic Jews, comes from Minhag Ashkenaz, which was the name the Jews gave to Germany. And they spoke Yiddish, a dialect of German. Yiddish is basically dying out, but for many decades or centuries, it was sort of like the common language among many European Jews. The Mizrahim is, I think, a modern name, but it refers to ancient Jewish communities from the Middle East and North Africa, such as Jews from Yemen, Iraq, and Morocco. Beta Israel is a name of the Jews from Ethiopia. So this is kind of a complicated story, but there are people who identify as Jews in Ethiopia. According to modern genetic research, maybe they don't have ancient Jewish ancestry, or maybe it's possible that some of them do or did. But the point is, it's not that unusual for there to be Jewish populations like that far away from Israel. Ethiopia is in eastern Africa, so it's not that far south of Egypt. And we know that in antiquity, there were a lot of Jews living in Egypt. There's even stories that the Beta Israel tell themselves that they descend from some Jews that lived in an island of the Nile River called Elephantine, and they had to flee at some point from persecution, and they went further upriver on the Nile until they reached Ethiopia, which is actually possible historically, but that might not be the story of how all the Beta Israel, became Jewish or their full history. But the point is, they are Jewish, and they don't follow Rabbinic Judaism, though. They follow an older, more ancient form of Judaism that doesn't use the Talmud or the traditions that developed after the Second Temple. And I think in that respect, at least in some regards, they resemble the Samaritans. The big difference is that they branched off from Rabbinic Judaism much later. So they do have other parts of the Tanakh, for example, just not the Talmud and later writings. Orthodox Judaism is the traditional form of Judaism. So this is Jews who follow all the traditional commandments or mitzvot, for example. And they didn't really become a distinct type of Jew until the Reform movement broke off from kind of mainstream Rabbinic Judaism in the early 19th century AD. So you could look at Orthodox Judaism as just the modern continuation of the Rabbinic Jewish tradition. And Reform Judaism is Rabbinic Judaism too, but it kind of branches off and doesn't have all the same beliefs and practices, for example. So some of the practices that are retained by Orthodox Jews are daily Torah study, following all the mitzvot, no exceptions, dietary laws, praying 3 times a day, segregating the sexes in the synagogue. They sit in separate parts of the synagogue, purification rituals for women. Rabbi Samson Hirsch was one of the founders of modern Orthodox Judaism. So not all Orthodox Jews are modern Orthodox or advocate, sort of combining modernity with the religion, but many do. And Hirsch encouraged Orthodox Jews to pursue a secular university education and to adapt themselves to the modern world, but also to still study the Torah and to keep all the commandments. The Haredim are the ultra-Orthodox, and they're the Orthodox who believe in more of a separation between themselves and the modern world, or at least certain aspects of modernity. The Sephardic Haredim often support Zionism and the modern state of Israel, whereas the Ashkenazi Haredim often actually oppose them. In the picture are some Haredim girls praying at the Western Wall in Jerusalem. The Western Wall is also known as the Wailing Wall. It's the only part of the Second Temple that's believed to have been preserved or is still standing, and so a lot of Jews will pray there to remember the destruction of the temple. Hasidim or Hasidic Jews are another main part of Jews today. So the Hasidic movement was founded by Baal Shem Tov, and as mentioned before, they emphasize joyful worship and song and dance. There's many sects, though, of Hasidic Judaism, each with its own teacher or Rebbe or Tzaddik, and some Hasidic men wear distinctive clothing, long black coats, fur hats, and earlocks. So this is when you don't cut the hair on the sides of your face, and ears. Some Hasidim are also Haredim or ultra-Orthodox, but not all. Reform Judaism emerged primarily in Germany during the Enlightenment period in the 18th century. And we talked about Moses Mendelssohn before. He was before Reform Judaism, but people like Moses Mendelssohn had an influence on the movement later on in the 19th century. They emphasized reason and social progress and emancipation for Jews. in the 19th century. And many Jews started assimilating into European culture and society. Reformed Jews often emphasize the ethical teachings of the prophets rather than strict ritual observance of the law. Abraham Geiger was an early example of a Reformed Jew. He argued that the Torah is not completely factually accurate, so he didn't advocate a literally correct interpretation of all the Torah. He abandoned the dietary laws, and he advocated for certain changes in ritual and worship. He also translated prayers from Hebrew into German or other local languages. And some of the examples of the reforms in liturgy were having organs in the synagogue. This was influenced by Christian churches. Having a shorter service during the Sabbath, and he ended the segregation of the sexes in the synagogue. Isaac Wise was a founder of the Reform organization in the United States, and he founded the Hebrew Union College in 1875. And an example of the reforms that have happened over the decades in Reform Judaism, since the 1970s, women have been permitted to be ordained as rabbis at Hebrew Union College, whereas before then that was never part of the Jewish tradition, having female clergy. Conservative Judaism emerged in the late 19th century among European Jews who rejected the more radical elements of Reform Judaism. So they emphasized historical elements of Jewish tradition without retaining all the practices of Orthodoxy. And they generally support Zionism, unlike some ultra-Orthodox Jews. Conservative Judaism is very prominent in North America, but less so in Israel or the UK. Solomon Schechter was the first president of the Jewish Theological Seminary, the main school for conservative Judaism. He led the conservative movement in the United States. Nowadays, there's considerable variation in local conservative congregations, often due to the influence of lay people. For example, some congregations use organs, and some do not. Some emphasize following all the dietary laws, while others do not. Reconstructionist Judaism is a more radical or progressive outgrowth of conservative Judaism. It was founded by Mordecai Kaplan, who viewed Judaism as an evolving culture, and he gave equal weight to religion, but also to ethics and the cultural aspects of Judaism. It's mainly been practiced in the United States and since the 1960s. So an example of the liberal aspects of Reconstructionist Judaism, it uses inclusive language, women participate in the liturgy, and they welcome single-parent families. Also, their interpretation of tikkun olam, or repairing the world, this is a concept from Kabbalah that the emanations of God caused fractures in these containers or receptacles in the creation, and that it's part of the duty of humans to help repair the creation. But in Reconstructionist Judaism, tikkun olam is interpreted as advocating for social justice. Humanistic Judaism is perhaps the most liberal or radical form of Judaism. It's a purely secularized approach that dates to 1965. It rejects or reinterprets many traditional Jewish beliefs. Humanistic Jews are secular humanists, so they completely deny the supernatural. They regard the Exodus from Egypt as a myth. They rarely use the word God, and they accept people of any ancestry, not just Jewish. The International Federation of Secular Humanistic Jews is the primary humanistic Jewish organization. There's also the renewal movement. This is a somewhat obscure aspect of liberal or progressive Judaism with roots in the 1960s counterculture. It attempts to renew Judaism, drawing from Jewish mysticism, Hasidic Judaism, music, and meditative traditions, although it's been criticized by some as excessively New Age. In terms of recent developments in Judaism and in Israel, there's been increased migration of Ashkenazi Jews to the modern state of Israel after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. And there were a large number of Beta Israel Jews who moved from Ethiopia to Israel after that as well. In terms of developments within Israel between secular and Orthodox Jews, when the nation was founded in 1948, there were Orthodox and other traditional religious Jews there, but the nation was secular, with the dominant social class being secular or at least non-Orthodox Ashkenazi Jews, many of whom were liberal, progressive, or socialist. But now Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jews have actually been growing as a proportion of the entire population, due in large part to their having higher birth rates than secular or otherwise non-Orthodox Jews. Chapter 35, Judaism in the Modern World. The modern Jewish population is around 13 million worldwide, which is 0.25% of the total world population. Of these 13 million Jews, 5 million live in Israel, where they constitute 78.7% of the population, and 5.7 million Jews live in the United States, where they constitute 2.1% of the population. You can see smaller populations of Jews in other parts of the world. In Europe, about 1.4 million. In Latin America and the Caribbean, about 470,000. These are 2010 numbers now. In sub-Saharan Africa, about 100,000. And in Asia and the Pacific, about 200,000. Despite their relatively small numbers as a percentage of the global population, Jews have made really large contributions to modern science and other aspects of culture like art, literature, media, entertainment, law, and politics. The reasons for this may be various, but one element that could be relevant is the fact that literacy was often valued in Rabbinic Judaism because of the necessity for Torah study. And so the high rates of literacy may be one of the reasons, and education generally, may be one of the reasons why Jews have been able to make contributions in all these areas. In terms of Jewish identity, who counts as a Jew? Not only is it complicated because of the fact that Judaism is both an ethnicity and a religion, and there's multiple distinct ethnicities within the broader Jewish umbrella, but there's also different religious views within Orthodoxy and Reform. The Orthodox Jewish view is that a Jew must be born to a Jewish mother or must convert to Judaism according to their Orthodox criteria. The Reform view is that a person is a Jew if at least one parent is Jewish and if they are raised in a Jewish community, or if they convert to Judaism according to the Reform criteria. So, as mentioned, the term Judaism can refer to ethnicity, not just to a religion. And many ethnic Jews, that is, people born to Jewish families, are not religious. More than 50% of Israeli Jews, in fact, identify as secular. And about half of the Jews in the United States do not belong to a synagogue or temple. So Jews were persecuted for many centuries, arguably millennia. And in the last couple of centuries, there was actually a rise of anti-Semitism, which we can define as systematic bias or discrimination against, or even persecution against Jews, a rise in the last several centuries. In many parts of Eastern Europe, mainly the Russian Empire, there were a lot of pogroms in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These were violent riots aimed at massacring or expelling Jews. You can see in the picture some of the unfortunate victims of these pogroms. The most infamous persecution of the Jews is the Holocaust, or the Shoah. Holocaust is kind of like a nickname for the event. The literal meaning of Holocaust is a burnt offering. So this was actually part of the sacrifices to God in the temple in Jerusalem. An animal would be killed and offered up to God, generally as a sin offering. But many Jews prefer the name Shoah because they think that the use of the religious terminology is inappropriate in this context. In any case, the Holocaust refers to the mass murder of Jews perpetrated by the Nazi regime in Germany under Adolf Hitler in the 1930s and 40s. Millions of Jews were killed. The usual number given is 6 million, and millions more were displaced and deprived of all their property. Zionism is a modern Jewish movement originating in the 1800s, a movement which seeks to establish a modern homeland for Jews. Many Jews began moving to Palestine, which is part of the Ottoman Empire, in the late 19th century. Now, Zionists did not initially agree on where the Jewish state should be founded. There were other proposals in other parts of the world, but eventually Palestine became focal, and that's where the bulk of Jews into Zionism ended up settling. After 1918, with the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in the First World War, Britain took control over Palestine, and they were basically granted authority to rule it as a kind of mandate under the League of Nations. Many Orthodox Jews settled in Palestine, but there were also secular Jews and socialists, some of whom created kibbutzim, or communal farms, that served an important part of the initial Jewish settlement there. And part of the motivation for Zionism was the centuries of persecution in Europe and elsewhere. A lot of Jews felt that they wouldn't be safe or even able to survive, possibly, unless they had their own homelands. Theodor Herzl, shown in the picture, was one of the main founders of Zionism. The modern state of Israel was established in 1948, and it largely grew out of the Zionist movement. After the end of the Second World War, Britain agreed to divest itself of its territories in the Middle East, including Palestine, but there were calls for statehood both among the Jews who lived in Palestine and among the Arab Christians and Muslims who lived there. The Arab population was predominantly Muslim, but there were a few Christians as well. So the British decided to divide the territory of Palestine between the Jews and the Arabs. But immediately after the declaration of the State of Israel in 1948, Arab nations from around invaded and tried to destroy the nascent State of Israel. Egypt, Syria, the Transjordan, and Iraq were involved. Despite being very much outnumbered, Israel was able to withstand destruction, and a ceasefire was declared a year later, and they even gained some territory in the exchange. There have been several Arab-Israeli wars and conflicts. The Six-Day War in 1967 began after Anwar Sadat of Egypt announced he would cut off shipping to Israel by the Straits of Tiran in the south, and Israel launched a preemptive attack against Egypt because of that announcement. Israel was able to defeat a large coalition of Arab states, which included Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and others, and they gained considerable territory, including the entire Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights in the north. The Yom Kippur War in 1973 saw Israel facing up against another coalition of Arab states, which included Egypt and Syria. And again, Israel was able to defeat all of them. They eventually gave up their territory in Sinai to Egypt, but the situation in Israel is still very unstable. Israel has occupied territory, including the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, that includes large numbers of Palestinian Arabs who don't have, for example, the right to vote in Israel. They do have their own governments, but their movements are very much curtailed by Israel. Israel has also built settlements in the West Bank, which are very controversial. So the modern nation state of Israel, which is majority Jewish, although not entirely, has very tense, oftentimes violent relations with its neighbors and with the various Arabs in the occupied territories. There were other conflicts within Israel, not just between Jews and Arabs. There are conflicts, for example, between secular Jews and Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jews. There's also ethnic conflicts between Ashkenazi Jews, which dominated the society and government from the beginning, and other types of Jewish ethnicities, the Sephardim, Mizrahim, and Beta Israel. Some Orthodox Jews in Israel actually oppose Zionism and the State of Israel, and many Orthodox Jews do not serve in the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, or military, because their ritual practices make it impossible for them to serve and keep up their observances. An example of some of the tensions or potential flashpoints is this group called the Gush Emunim, or Block of the Faithful. They are a fundamentalist Jewish group that was founded in 1974. They claim a divine right to settle in the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and the Golan Heights. In the picture is some Israeli settlers in Ofra celebrating the festival of Purim. A little bit more about Jewish religious life in the modern world. A lot of it is still centered on Torah study at rabbinical seminaries. There's also that concept of tikkun olam, or repairing or mending the world. So it comes from Kabbalah, but it's more generally known by Jews today. It's often interpreted as humans joining God in the task of mending the world through participating in the covenant and the covenantal relationship that was established under Moses and other prophets. There's also a strong sense of social justice among many Jews. If you go back to the ancient Jewish prophets, they often decried the injustices of kings or others in power, and their message still resonates today. Judaism also emphasizes the dignity and responsibility of all humans. Another theme of modern Jewish religious life is diversity of opinion. You can see this reflected in earlier rabbinic Judaism with the disagreements among the rabbis of the Talmud. The same sect or branch of Judaism can have multiple schools of thought. There's a saying, where you have two Jews, you will have three opinions. In terms of the future of Judaism, there's a lot of assimilation on the one hand. So if you look at Jews in the United States, for example, and other nations where they have greater freedom than in past centuries, in any event, many of those Jews have partially assimilated or married non-Jews. And some of them pass on their traditions to their children, but not all of them. So there's a kind of gradual process of assimilation going on, at least in general. Nevertheless, there's also been a rise of religious Judaism, especially, for example, in the state of Israel. The secular Jews there, which formerly were so dominant, they have lower birth rates than the Orthodox and the ultra-Orthodox, or Haredim. And so the latter are becoming gradually more numerous and more influential politically and culturally. There's also been a seeming rise in anti-Semitism in recent decades by Christians, but also especially by Muslims in various parts of the world. A lot of the hostility between Muslims and Jews is centered on the conflict between Israel and the Palestinian Arabs, most of whom are Muslim, and basically a lot of them lost their lands over the decades since 1948. You can see in this demographic chart, though, of modern Israel from 2017 that demographically Israel is actually growing. They have a lot of young children. So this is kind of like a healthy demographic pyramid. And that's different from a lot of other modern nations where people are having fewer children, and so they often have more old or middle-aged people than young people. And that means their population will decline in the long run. But Israel is not like that, largely because of the larger families of Orthodox and Haredim. But if I recall correctly, even secular Jewish families in Israel tend to have more children on average than families in other modernized or developed nations. So what this could mean is that by avoiding demographic collapse, Israel, but also Judaism itself, could survive in the future. Okay, so that's it for this summary of Judaism. I hope it was helpful, even though I had to, of course, gloss over a lot of things. Next up, we're going to take a look at Christianity. Until next time.